thing that said his hands had been busy or his mind had been elsewhere for longer than a smoke break. "Asuma-san," Izumo said, straightening behind the desk. "You're back early. Thought the Suna mission was, where's Kurenai?" The question landed flat, no warmth in it. Izumo blinked. She had Southeast patrol last night, Genma's slot. She probably went home after her shift ended. She didn't check in this morning. Asuma's jaw worked around the cigarette. "I sent a hawk ahead from the border, asked Kotsu to have her meet me at the gate. He went to her apartment an hour ago. She's not there. Bed wasn't slept in." Izumo's hand was already reaching for the duty roster before Asuma finished the sentence. He pulled the sheet, scanned last night's check-in log. She keyed her half-hourly at 2200, standard acknowledgement. "Next check-in at 2230, he trailed off. The 2230 slot was blank, so was every slot after it. She missed the 2230, and the watch station didn't flag it. Asuma pulled the cigarette from his mouth and looked at it like he'd forgotten it was there. "Who was on the watch station?" Izumo checked. "Tanbo Tabaitake? Get him." There was something about the way Asuma said it. Not loud, not angry, just dense. Like the words had been compressed into something that would expand if you gave them room. That made Izumo abandon the desk and go himself instead of sending a runner. Tanbo was in the watch station break room, eating a rice ball with the methodical disinterest of someone at the end of a long shift. He was a sensor type, reliable, one of the village's permanent intelligence staff. Not the kind of man who missed things. When Izumo told him Asuma was asking about the 2230 check-in, Tanbo's chewing slowed. "She acknowledged at 2200, Tanbo said. "I logged it. 2230 came around, I sent the tone, no response. Waited 2 minutes, sent again, no response. I flagged it in the system and dispatched a patrol to check her route." Izumo felt the first cold finger of something unpleasant touch the base of his skull. And patrol came back 20 minutes later, said the route was clear, no signs of disturbance. "I assumed she'd had a communication malfunction and finished her route manually. It's happened before. Those field radios are 15 years old. I logged a maintenance note and moved on. You didn't send anyone to confirm she'd returned." Tanbo's face didn't change, but something behind it shifted. The rice ball sat forgotten in his hand. "Protocol for a missed check-in with a clear patrol report is to log and flag for morning review. That's what I did. She's a Jonin. If she'd been in trouble, she would have." "She's missing, Tanbo." Tanbo set the rice ball down. "Define missing." Izumo told him what Asuma had said. The apartment, the bed, the silence. By the time he finished, Tanbo was already standing, his face the careful blank of someone running calculations they didn't like. "Get me the patrol report from last night." Tanbo said, "The one that cleared her route. I want the name of every shinobi on it, and I want them in this room within the hour." Izumo went. Behind him, he heard Tanbo pull his chair to the communication console and begin keying a sequence he recognized. The priority alert channel, the one that went straight to the Hawkage's office. The morning was still young and golden and ordinary, but it wasn't anymore. Asuma didn't wait for the system to work. He couldn't. The machinery of the village, the watch stations, the communication logs, the chain of command, all of it was designed to process information at a pace that assumed threats were external and responses could be measured. But the thing clawing at the inside of his ribs didn't care about protocol. He went to her apartment first, even though Kotsu had already checked. He needed to see it himself. The door was locked, a good sign, maybe, because it meant she'd locked it when she left for patrol. He let himself in with the spare key she kept in a seal-locked compartment in the door frame. A compartment only he knew about, because she'd shown him one night after too much sake. Laughing at his expression when he realized she'd hidden a key using a seal that could only be opened by someone with a specific chakra signature. His signature. She'd keyed it to his. He hadn't known what to say then, and he didn't know what to feel about it now, standing in her empty apartment with the morning light making geometry on the floor through the half-closed blinds. The bed was made. Not slept in, like Kotsu said. Her mission pack was in the closet, her off-duty weapons in the drawer beside the bed. The tea tin, the gyokuro he'd brought her, sat on the kitchen counter, 2/3 full. Her patrol gear was gone. Flak jacket, standard weapons loadout, radio. He stood in the middle of her kitchen and made himself breathe. In, out. The cigarette was back in his mouth, still unlit. His trench knives hung at his hips, and his fingers kept drifting to them, not reaching, just hovering, the way they did when his body was preparing for something his mind hadn't authorized yet. She could be fine. She could have finished patrol, gone to a friend's place, fallen asleep on someone's couch. She could be at the hospital, a training injury she hadn't reported, a twisted ankle, something stupid and minor. She could be a dozen places, and the fact that he'd sent a hawk and she hadn't been at any of the places he'd asked Kotsu to check didn't mean. It did, though. He knew it did. Kurenai was the most reliable person he'd ever met. She was pathological about communication, check-ins, meeting times, dinner reservations. She'd once sent a messenger slug to tell him she'd be 4 minutes late to a lunch date. 4 minutes. The idea that she'd miss a radio check-in, not return to her apartment, and be unreachable by morning was so far outside the boundaries of who she was that it broke the frame entirely. Something had happened to her. Asuma left the apartment, locked the door behind him, and went to the Hawkage Tower at a pace that was just short of a run. The third Hawkage's office smelled like pipe smoke and old paper, the way it always did, the way it had since Asuma was a child sneaking in to steal rice crackers from the bottom drawer of the desk. Hiruzen Sarutobi sat behind that desk now, with his pipe cradled in his weathered hands, and he looked old. Not in the dignified way he usually managed, but in the real way, the way that showed when something had put weight on him before he'd had time to arrange his face. Tanbo's alert had reached him 20 minutes ago. Asuma's arrival made it personal. "Sit down," Hiruzen said. Asuma didn't sit. He stood in front of the desk with his arms at his sides and his shoulders rigid and his unlit cigarette clenched between his teeth, and he said, "What do we know?" Hiruzen didn't push the sitting issue. He knew his son. Kurenai Yuhai took the Southeast Patrol at 2100 last night, substituting for Genma Shiranui. She made her 2130 and 2200 check-ins on schedule. She failed to respond at 2230. The watch station dispatched a follow-up patrol that reported no disturbances along her route. She has not been seen or heard from since her 2200 acknowledgement. That's approximately 11 hours unaccounted for. Who was on the follow-up patrol? 2 Chunin. Mazuku and Iwashi. They're being pulled in now. Asuma's jaw tightened. Chunin. We send Chunin to check on a missing Jonin. We send Chunin to check a patrol route that was reported quiet in a quadrant that hasn't seen a security incident in years. That's standard procedure, Asuma, and you know it. Hiruzen's voice was even, but his eyes, those eyes that had seen 3 wars and buried 2 Hawkage, were watching his son the way a medic watches a wound. I've already dispatched a tracking team to her last confirmed position. Hana Inuzuka is leading it with 2 of her nin dogs. If Kurenai was anywhere on that route, they'll find her trail. And if they don't, then we escalate. Escalate to what? Hiruzen set his pipe down. He did it slowly, placing it in the carved wooden rest at the corner of his desk with a precision that was its own kind of signal. When the third Hawkage set down his pipe mid-conversation, it meant he was about to say something he wanted to land without distraction. Asuma, I understand what she means to you. I'm not going to pretend I don't, and I'm not going to treat this as routine, because it isn't. A Jonin going dark inside village walls is a serious matter regardless of personal connections, but I need you functional. I need you thinking, not reacting. Can you do that? Asuma said nothing for a long moment. Then he pulled the cigarette from his mouth, looked at it, and put it back. Yeah. Good. I'm putting you on the search team, but not in command. Ibiki Morino will coordinate. Ibiki's interrogation division, not search and rescue, which is exactly why I want him. If Kurenai was taken by someone inside or outside this village, Ibiki will approach it as an intelligence problem, not a tracking exercise. You'll work under his direction. Are we clear? Asuma nodded. It was a stiff, mechanical thing, but it was a nod. Go meet Hana's team at Training Ground 16. That's the area of her route closest to the 2200 check-in timestamp. I'll have Ibiki there within the hour. Asuma was moving before the sentence finished. Hiruzen watched him go, watched the rigid line of his back, the hands that kept drifting to the trench knives, the coiled energy of a man trying very hard to hold something explosive in a container too small for it. And then the door closed. And the old man was alone with his pipe and the morning light and a feeling he couldn't name. No, he could name it. He just didn't want to. It was the feeling he got when the foundations shifted. When something he'd assumed was stable turned out to be balanced on a point, and the wind was picking up. Hiruzen picked up his pipe, relit it, and pulled a long breath of smoke. Then he pressed the seal on his desk that summoned his Anbu guard. "Get me the patrol assignment records for the last 6 months," he said to the masked figure that appeared. "Southeast quadrant, every name, every shift, every incident report. And get me the maintenance logs for the Southeast training grounds, specifically any earth-moving or excavation work that's been approved or reported." The Anbu vanished without a word. Hiruzen sat back and smoked and thought about the things that could make a Jonin disappear inside her own village walls, and none of the answers were good. Hana and Yuzuka's dogs found the scent trail at Training Ground 17, exactly where the 2200 check-in would have placed Kurenai on her patrol route. They found it, followed it 40 meters along the fence line, and then lost it. Not faded. Not dispersed by wind or rain or the passage of time. Lost. The trail ended at a point on the path, as if Kurenai had simply ceased to exist. Hana was kneeling at the termination point when Asuma arrived, one hand on the head of her lead dog, who was pacing in tight circles with his hackles up and a whine threading through his teeth. She looked up at Asuma, and her expression told him everything before she opened her mouth. "She was here," Hana said. "Definitely, strong scent, fresh, consistent with last night. She walked this path heading northeast at a normal pace. No running, no evasion pattern. She was on routine patrol, and then she stopped here and the trail just ends." Asuma looked at the ground. Packed earth, dry, scuffed by years of training sessions, nothing remarkable about it. What could do that? Cut a scent trail clean? Hana's mouth pressed thin. A few things. High-grade chemical countermeasure, but we'd smell the agent itself. Spatial temporal displacement, a teleportation jutsu, but that leaves chakra residue, and I'm not picking up anything unusual. The third option, she hesitated. Say it. Sealing. A containment seal sophisticated enough to lock down not just a person but their entire chemical signature. Sweat, skin cells, breath, everything. If someone sealed her into a space that was itself sealed against leakage, the trail would end exactly like this. Clean, like she was never here. Asuma stared at the patch of ground where the trail died. His hand was on his trench knife, and this time he didn't move it away. "That's not standard sealing," he said. "That's master-level work, Jiraiya level. Who in this village could, I don't know, but whoever it is, they knew what they were doing. This wasn't opportunistic, Asuma, this was planned. The location, the timing, the countermeasures, someone knew she'd be on this route and prepared for exactly her." Asuma turned in a slow circle, scanning the training ground, the trees, the fence line. Everything looked normal. Everything looked like what it was, a training area in the quietest part of the village, the last place anyone would expect a Jonin to vanish. Which, of course, was exactly the point. "Where the hell are those Chunin who cleared this route last night?" he said. Hana shook her head. "On their way." But Asuma, if the scene was already sealed and cleaned by the time they walked through, they wouldn't have seen anything. This isn't a failure of the patrol. This is someone who knew the response protocols and timed their actions around them. That landed like a stone in still water. Asuma felt the implications radiate outward, ring after ring, each one worse than the last. Someone who knew the patrol schedule. Someone who knew the watch station protocols. Someone who knew how long it would take for a missed check-in to generate a response. Someone inside the village. He didn't say it. Hana didn't say it. But the words hung in the space between them, heavy as smoke, and neither of them could wave it away. Ibiki Moreno arrived at Training Ground 17 with the silent efficiency of a man who had spent his career walking into bad situations and making them worse for the people responsible. He was tall, scarred, and carried himself with the deliberate economy of movement that characterized either monks or killers, and Ibiki was not a monk. He surveyed the scene in silence. Listened to Hana's report. Examined the termination point of the scent trail, crouching over it with his hands on his knees and his scarred face expressionless. Then he stood and looked at Asuma. "You're compromised," Ibiki said, not unkindly, just factually. "I know, and you're going to work this anyway." "Yeah." Ibiki studied him for a moment, then nodded once. "Fine, but you follow my lead, and if I tell you to step back, you step back. I won't have you contaminating my investigation because you can't see straight." Asuma said nothing, which Ibiki apparently took as agreement. "Here's what we're working with," Ibiki said, addressing both Asuma and Hana. A Jonin-level Kunoichi disappeared from a routine patrol inside village walls. The abduction, and I'm calling it an abduction until evidence tells me otherwise, was executed with a level of preparation that suggests extensive reconnaissance and planning. The perpetrator has advanced sealing knowledge, detailed information about village patrol protocols, and the ability to subdue a Jonin without leaving detectable evidence of a struggle. He paused, letting that settle. That's a short list of suspects. I can think of maybe 15 people in this village with that combination of skills, and most of them are in Anbu or the intelligence division, which means we have a problem that goes beyond one missing Kunoichi. If this is internal, we're looking at a security compromise that the Hawkage will need to contain before it spreads. Asuma's voice came out rough. And if it's external, an infiltrator? Then we have a different problem, but the methodology is the same. We work the evidence. We identify the seal type, Hana. I want a full analysis of any residual energy at the scent termination point. If there's even a whisper of chakra signature, I want it isolated and profiled. Asuma, you know Kurenai better than anyone. I need a complete picture of her recent activities. Missions, contacts, conversations, anything she mentioned that struck you as unusual, even if it seems irrelevant. Asuma was already thinking, already rifling through memories with the desperate focus of a man looking for a lifeline. Missions, she'd had a standard rotation, nothing classified, nothing that should have made her a target. Contacts, her Genin team, her colleagues, the usual social circuit. Conversations, he stopped. 2 weeks ago, he said slowly. She mentioned something. We were at Yakiniku Q, just the two of us. She said she'd noticed someone following her. Not in a threatening way, she said it felt more like observation, like someone studying her patterns. Ibiki's eyes sharpened. Did she describe the observer? No, she said she never got a clear look. Always at the edge of her awareness, always gone when she turned to check. She put it down to professional paranoia, said every Jonin gets that feeling sometimes, and it usually turns out to be nothing. Did she report it? I told her to. She said she would. Ibiki's expression didn't change, but something in the quality of his attention shifted, the way a predator's focus shifts when movement registers in the underbrush. I'll check the incident reports. If she filed one, we'll have a timestamp and a location pattern. If she didn't. He let the sentence hang. Asuma knew what it meant. If she hadn't reported it, then the only record of the observation was his memory of a dinner conversation 2 weeks ago, and they were working with ghosts. Ibiki began issuing orders, more tracking teams, a forensic SEAL specialist from the intelligence division, a quiet lockdown on information about the disappearance until they knew what they were dealing with. Asuma listened, absorbed, filed it all away. He was functioning. He was thinking. He was doing exactly what his father had asked of him. And underneath it all, in the place where the thinking stopped and the raw thing lived, he was terrified. Kurenai woke to darkness and the taste of copper. She didn't move, didn't open her eyes beyond a slit. Didn't change the rhythm of her breathing. Consciousness returned in layers. First the awareness that she was awake, then the body mapping, the automatic inventory every shinobi ran upon waking in an unfamiliar situation. Position. Lying on her right side on a surface that was firm but not hard. A cot or a pad of some kind. Her left shoulder ached, the one she'd landed on in the pit, but it wasn't dislocated. Wrenched, maybe. Functional restraints. Her wrists were bound in front of her with something that wasn't rope and wasn't metal. It had a faint texture, almost like fabric, but rigid, unyielding. When she flexed her fingers experimentally, she felt the edges of seal tags pressed against the inside of each wrist. Her ankles were similarly bound. The suppression seal from the pit was still on her left ankle. She could feel its dead weight, the absence of chakra like a phantom limb environment. The air was cool and dry, with a faint mineral smell that suggested underground, stone or earth walls. No wind, no external sound. The silence was so complete it had its own texture, a thick, muffled quality that pressed against her eardrums. She opened her eyes fully. The darkness wasn't total. There was a light source, small, steady, warm-toned, somewhere to her left. She turned her head and saw a lamp. Not electric, not a candle. A small, seal-powered light set into the wall, casting a soft amber glow that illuminated a space roughly the size of a large bedroom. The walls were earth-packed, smooth, reinforced with something that gave them a faintly glazed appearance. Support beams ran across the ceiling at regular intervals, wooden, treated, bearing seal arrays she could see but couldn't read from this angle. The floor was covered with woven mats. Against the far wall was a shelf holding sealed containers, food storage, she guessed from the labeling. Beside it, a water barrel with a tap. A folding screen in one corner suggested a toilet area. A small table and a single chair sat in the middle of the room, and on the table was a stack of books, a cup, and a folded blanket. It was, she realized with a chill that had nothing to do with temperature, furnished. This wasn't a hole someone had thrown her into. This was a space that had been prepared. Lived in, maybe, or at least stocked and maintained over time. The mats on the floor were clean. The lamp was full. The water barrel was full. Someone had built this place and equipped it for exactly this purpose. Kurenai sat up. The motion sent pain through her shoulder and a wave of dizziness through her head. After effects of whatever she'd been drugged with. She breathed through it, waited for the room to stabilize, and then swung her legs off the cot and put her feet on the floor. The seal bindings on her wrists allowed her hands to be about 6 inches apart. Enough to eat, drink, use a toilet. Not enough to form hand signs, not even close. Whoever had designed them understood exactly what a shinobi needed to be dangerous, and had calibrated the restraints to prevent it while allowing basic function. That same careful, considered approach that she'd noticed in the brushwork on the suppression seal. She stood. Her legs held, though her knees felt loose and unreliable. She took a step, then another, moving toward the center of the room where the light was strongest. The space was perhaps 5 meters by 4. One door, heavy, wooden, reinforced with metal plates and more seal arrays. No handle on this side. No windows. No ventilation that she could see, though the air was fresh, which meant there was an intake somewhere, hidden in the walls or ceiling, probably filtered and sealed. An underground bunker designed to hold a shinobi. Specifically designed to hold her, if the chakra suppression and hand sign prevention were any indication. This wasn't a generic cell. This was bespoke. Kurenai turned slowly, taking it all in. Then she sat in the single chair, placed her bound hands on the table, and waited. She was a genjutsu specialist. The core of her art was patience, the willingness to watch, to listen, to let information come to you instead of chasing it. Her captor had planned this carefully, which meant they wanted something, and people who wanted something eventually had to ask for it. So she waited. She didn't know how long. There was no way to track time in the bunker, no natural light, no clock, no external reference. It might have been 20 minutes or 2 hours. She used the time to study everything she could see, committing details to memory, building a mental map. The seal arrays on the ceiling beams were suppression type. She was almost certain area effect chakra dampening that would make it nearly impossible to mold chakra, even if the personal suppression seal were somehow removed. Redundant systems. Layers of containment. Whoever built this place didn't rely on a single point of failure. The door opened. No sound preceded it, no footsteps, no key in a lock. The seal arrays along its edges simply dimmed, and the door swung inward on silent hinges, and the figure from the pit walked in. He was shorter than she'd estimated from the pit. The angle had been deceptive. 5'6", maybe 5'7", with a build that was lean rather than slim, the kind of wiry musculature that came from constant movement rather than gym training. He wore dark, nondescript clothing, not a uniform, not a costume, just practical layers in muted colors. The face mask from the pit was gone. Kurenai looked at the face behind it and felt the floor drop out from under her for the second time that night. She knew that face. The whole village knew that face, though most of them looked away when they saw it, or through it, or past it. The way you looked past something you didn't want to acknowledge was there. Blonde hair, cut shorter than she remembered from the last time she'd bothered to notice. Blue eyes, clear and still. The whisker marks on his cheeks, thin parallel lines that most people assumed were scars but weren't. Naruto Uzumaki stood in the doorway of her cell, carrying a tray with a bowl of rice, a cup of tea, and a pair of chopsticks, and he looked at her with an expression that was absolutely, terrifyingly nothing, not angry, not nervous, not gloating, not apologetic, not excited, just watching. The way you watched an experiment to see what it would do. Kurenai's mind raced through everything she knew about him and came up embarrassingly short. Uzumaki, Jinchuriki, orphan. Academy failure turned genin, no, he'd been promoted to chunin after the exams, she remembered that much. On Kakashi's team. Loud. Brash. The dead last who'd surprised everyone, except the boy standing in front of her wasn't loud, and he wasn't brash, and the dead last didn't build underground bunkers with master-level seal arrays and abduct Jonin without leaving a trace. You, she said. He set the tray on the table. His movements were unhurried, precise. He placed the bowl in front of her, the tea to the right, the chopsticks parallel to the bowl's edge. Then he stepped back 2 paces, exactly out of her reach even if she lunged with her bound hands, and stood with his hands at his sides. The rice is from the batch I made this morning. The tea is bancha. The chopsticks are bamboo. He said it like a report. No inflection, no warmth, no edge. There's nothing in any of it. You can eat or not. Kurenai didn't look at the food. She kept her eyes on his face, searching for what? Some crack in the blankness. Some hint of the boy she'd seen around the village, the one who shouted about becoming Hawkage and wore orange like a declaration of war against subtlety. She couldn't find him. The person in front of her was someone else entirely, and she didn't know when the switch had happened or if the loud boy had ever been real in the first place. Naruto. She said his name deliberately, grounding it, making it real. You kidnapped a Jonin of Kano Hagakure. Do you understand what that means? Yes. They'll look for me. Asuma will tear this village apart. Something flickered across his face, there and gone, too fast to read. I know. Then why? He didn't answer immediately. He looked at her, really looked, with those still blue eyes that were nothing like the bright, desperate things she half remembered from academy visits and chance encounters on the street. And she had the unsettling sense that he was seeing more than she wanted to show. Eat, he said. We'll talk when you're ready. He turned and walked to the door. Kurenai surged to her feet, chair scraping back, bound hands slamming the table. We'll talk now. Naruto stopped. He didn't turn around. She stared at the back of his head, at the blonde hair and the slim shoulders and the absolute stillness of him, and she waited for something, anger, fear, some kind of human response to a Jonin's command voice. You're dehydrated, he said, still facing the door. Your shoulder needs ice, which I'll bring. The sedative I used has a side effect, mild nausea for the first 6 hours. Eating will help, fighting won't. A pause. I'm not going to hurt you, Kurenai-san, that was never the point. He stepped through the door. The seal arrays along its edges flared, and it swung shut with a sound like a held breath being released. And Kurenai was alone with a bowl of rice and a cup of tea, and a silence so complete she could hear her own heartbeat, steady and strong and furious. She didn't eat. She sat back down, placed her hands on the table, and began to think. Her captor was 16 years old. He was the village Jinchuriki. He had skills that nobody knew about, skills that spoke of years of secret training and preparation. He had built a facility designed to contain a Jonin, and he had used it with the calm efficiency of someone executing a long-rehearsed plan, and he had called her Kurenai-san. Polite, formal. The way a student addressed a teacher, or a junior addressed a superior. And the dissonance between that small courtesy and the reality of where she was sitting made something twist in her chest that wasn't fear. She didn't know what it was yet. But she knew she needed to figure it out, because whatever Naruto Uzumaki wanted from her, he'd been planning this for a long time, and she was the only person who knew the truth. And she was sealed in a box underground with no chakra and no weapons and no way to tell anyone. She looked at the rice. Looked at the tea. Looked at the door he'd disappeared through. Then she picked up the chopsticks and began to eat, because she was a shinobi, and shinobi survived first and figured out the rest later. On the surface, October sunlight poured over a village that didn't know yet what had happened beneath it. The search teams fanned out across the southeast quadrant. Ibiki made calls. Asuma stalked the perimeter of Training Ground 17 like a caged animal, running his hands along fence posts and tree trunks, as if the wood itself might tell him where she'd gone. And across the village, in a cramped apartment in the civilian quarter, a blond boy locked his door behind him, hung up his dark jacket, and pulled on an orange jumpsuit that fit him like a costume. He checked his face in the cracked bathroom mirror, made sure the blankness was gone, made sure the mask was on, the right mask, the one that grinned and shouted and never shut up. And then he went to the window, opened it, and let the morning noise of the village wash over him. Someone, several streets over, was calling a name. A dog was barking. A vendor was arguing about the price of fish. Naruto Uzumaki looked out at Konoha and let his face do what it was supposed to do. The squint, the grin, the dumb, bright openness of a boy who didn't know any better. And then he dropped out of the window and headed toward the training grounds. Because he had a team meeting at 9, and Kakashi-sensei was never on time, but Sakura would notice if he was late. And Sakura noticing things was the kind of loose thread he couldn't afford right now. He walked through the village the way he always did. Loud, visible, taking up space, greeting people who didn't greet him back, laughing at things that weren't funny, being exactly what everyone expected him to be. Nobody looked twice. That was the whole point. Chapter 2. Beneath the surface, the second day was worse than the first. Not because anything happened, that was the problem. Nothing happened. Kurenai sat in the amber light of her cell and listened to a silence so total that her own breathing became a kind of companion, the only rhythm in a world stripped of rhythm. No footsteps above her. No wind. No birdsong, no traffic, no distant voices carrying through walls. Just the faint, almost subliminal hum of the seals embedded in the stone, a vibration she felt more in her teeth than her ears. She'd slept, eventually. Not by choice, her body had simply demanded it after 12 hours of vigilance, dragging her under despite every intention to stay awake. She'd woken with a start, disoriented, her shoulders screaming, and for 3 terrible seconds she hadn't known where she was. Then the amber light registered, and the mats on the floor, and the faint mineral smell of underground stone, and it all came back with the weight of a collapsing building. She was in a bunker. Naruto Uzumaki had put her here, and nobody knew. Kurenai rolled off the cot, stood, stretched as well as the wrist bindings allowed, and began her morning routine. Not because she felt routine, but because routine was structure, and structure was sanity. And sanity was the only weapon she had left. She washed her face at the water barrel, using the tap to fill the small basin that sat on a shelf beside it. The water was clean, slightly cool, with no chemical taste. She used the toilet area behind the folding screen, functional, as she'd noted before, with a basic waste disposal system that seemed to be seal-powered like everything else in this place. Private. He'd given her that much. She examined her wrist bindings in the better light she'd found by standing directly beneath one of the seal lamps. The material was a composite, some kind of treated fabric reinforced with embedded wire, flexible enough to allow basic movement, but strong enough to resist any force she could generate without chakra. The seal tags pressed against her inner wrists were warm to the touch, pulsing faintly, and she could feel them actively suppressing her tenketsu. She couldn't mold chakra any more than she could fly. She tried anyway. Closed her eyes, reached inward for the familiar reservoir that had been part of her since she was 5 years old, the well of energy that every shinobi learned to tap as naturally as breathing. It was there. She could feel it, distant and muffled, like hearing music through a thick wall. Present but inaccessible. The seals didn't drain her chakra. They contained it, kept it circulating in her system at a baseline level that prevented damage to her chakra network, while making it impossible to externalize. Whoever designed these understood chakra theory at a level that most academy instructors didn't. Crude suppression seals could cause chakra sickness, headaches, nausea, organ damage over time. These were calibrated to maintain her health while eliminating her ability to fight. The precision made her skin crawl. She cataloged the room again, more carefully this time. The books on the shelf. 3 novels she recognized. 1 she'd been reading, which meant he'd been in her apartment. 2 technical texts on genjutsu theory, and a book of poetry by a Fire Country author she'd mentioned liking in a conversation with Anko at a restaurant 6 months ago. The food stores in the sealed containers: rice, dried fish, preserved vegetables, tea, salt, oil. Enough for weeks. The water barrel had a seal on its base that she suspected was connected to an underground water source, which meant it would refill itself. Weeks. He'd planned for weeks. Kurenai sat in the chair, placed her bound hands on the table, and did what she did best. She analyzed. The room told a story. Every captivity scenario did. The conditions of confinement revealed the psychology of the captor as clearly as a conversation, sometimes more so. A cruel captor gave you a bare cell, darkness, deprivation. A professional captor gave you the minimum necessary to maintain your value as an asset. An amateur gave you too much or too little, the inconsistencies betraying their uncertainty. This room was none of those things. It was considered. That was the word that kept coming back to her. The mattress on the cot was firm but comfortable. The blanket was warm. The food was real food, not rations. The books were selected for her specifically. The bathroom was private. The lighting was adjustable. It was the room of someone who had thought carefully about what a person needed to exist in a confined space without losing their mind, and had provided it. Not lavishly, not apologetically, but competently. The way you'd prepare a guest room for someone you expected to stay a while. Except guests could leave. Kurenai pressed her palms flat on the table and breathed. The anger was there, God, was it there? A banked fire in her chest that she'd been carefully tending since the moment she'd recognized his face. But anger without direction was just heat. She needed to be smarter than that. She needed to think like what she was. A jonin, a genjutsu specialist, a woman who'd spent her career learning how to get inside people's heads. Naruto Uzumaki had put her in a box. Fine. She was going to take him apart from inside it. She started building his profile, what she knew. He was 16. He was the Jinchuriki of the 9-tailed fox. He had grown up an orphan in a village that hated him for something that wasn't his fault, raised by a system that had failed him so comprehensively that the failure itself had become invisible. Just another feature of the landscape, like the Hawkage Mountain or the Memorial Stone. He'd been loud, obnoxious, desperate for attention. He'd failed the academy exam multiple times. He'd been placed on Team 7 with Kakashi Hadake, Sasuke Uchiha, and Sakura Haruno. He'd fought in the Chunin exams. He'd been promoted. And at some point, she didn't know when, couldn't pin it down, he'd stopped being the kid she thought he was and become someone else entirely. The mask. That was the key. The loud, brash, attention-seeking persona wasn't a personality, it was a jutsu. The most sophisticated genjutsu Kurenai had ever encountered, and it didn't use a single drop of chakra. He'd built it out of behavior, out of expectation, out of the village's own desire to see him as harmless and stupid. He'd given them exactly what they wanted, and they'd never thought to question it, because who questions a gift she thought about the seals? Self-taught, according to everything she could infer from the brushwork. No formal training, no master, no access to the classified archives where the real sealing knowledge was kept. He'd developed this skill in isolation, working from first principles, and the results were, she had to admit it, even through the fury, extraordinary. The fourth Hokage had been the last true seal master in Konoha, and this boy's work, while different in approach, showed a similar depth of understanding. The fourth Hokage, who had sealed the Nine Tails into Naruto the night he was born. There was an irony there so sharp it could cut. She thought about his effect. The flatness, the control, the absence of visible emotion. That wasn't trained composure, she knew trained composure, she practiced it every day. That was something else. Something that developed when a person learned early that their emotions didn't matter to anyone, that expressing need or pain or loneliness was worse than useless, because it gave people ammunition. You didn't learn to suppress your emotions like that in a classroom. You learned it in the dark, alone, night after night, until the silence became your native language. Kurenai felt something move in her chest that wasn't anger, and she crushed it immediately. Understanding the enemy was not the same as sympathizing with the enemy. He had taken her. He was holding her against her will. Whatever had shaped him into this, whatever the village had done or failed to do, he had crossed a line that understanding could not uncross. But understanding could be used. She heard the door before she saw it. A subtle shift in the air pressure, the seal arrays dimming from their steady glow to something softer, signaling deactivation. Then the door swung open and Naruto walked in. He was carrying another tray. This one had miso soup, rice, pickled radish, and tea, a proper breakfast, portioned and arranged with the same careful precision as the night before. He wore the same dark, nondescript clothing. His face was the same blank canvas, but something was different. Kurenai caught it in the first second, the way she'd been trained to catch micro-expressions and body language tells. The faintest shadow under his eyes, a tension in his jaw that hadn't been there last night, a fractional stiffness in the way he set the tray down. He'd slept badly, or not at all. Something was bothering him. "Good morning," he said. Kurenai looked at the tray, then at him. "Is it? I can't tell, no windows." The observation landed exactly where she'd aimed it, a reminder that she was imprisoned, delivered in a conversational tone that denied him the comfort of pretending this was normal. His jaw tightened another fraction. "It's about 8 in the morning. I can bring a clock if you want." "I want to leave." "I know." He pulled back the second chair, there were two now, he'd brought another one and sat across from her. The table was between them, the tray to her right. He folded his hands on the surface, mirroring her posture from last night, and she recognized the gesture for what it was. A bid for symmetry, for the appearance of two people sitting at a table having a conversation instead of a captor and his prisoner. "You didn't eat last night," he said. Kurenai said nothing. She had eaten eventually, after he'd left, after she'd examined the rice and the tea with every sense available to her and concluded that they weren't drugged, because drugging her food would be counterproductive if he wanted her functional, which he clearly did. But she wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of knowing that. Naruto glanced at the tray from the night before, still on the side table where she'd left it. The bowl was empty, the cup drained. His eyes tracked the details, and she saw the flicker, not satisfaction, not quite, but something adjacent. Recognition. He'd noted the evidence and filed it. "I need to explain some things," he said. "About the bunker, about the seals, about what happens from here." What happens from here is that Konoha finds me, and you spend the rest of your very short life in a cell that makes this one look like a resort. Maybe, but not today. He said it without bravado, without defiance, a statement of probability. The search teams are working the training grounds. They've found the pit, I expected that. It was designed to be found, to give them something to analyze and waste time on. The scent trail ends clean. The chakra trail ends clean. The forensic SEALs I left on the site will keep their SEAL division busy for about a week before they figure out the arrays are designed to lead them in circles. Kurenai absorbed that. He'd built decoys into the abduction site, not just countermeasures, active misdirection. Layers of false trails designed to consume investigative resources. The pit itself was a distraction, a piece of evidence left deliberately to control the narrative. You're playing them, she said. I'm managing the timeline. There's a difference. Explain it to me. Something shifted in his expression. Not a crack exactly, but a loosening, like a knot easing a single thread. He wanted to explain. She could see it. The desire to be understood, to have someone comprehend the scope of what he'd built, was pressing against whatever discipline held him together. It was the most human thing she'd seen from him. She filed it, pulled up a chair in her mind, and sat that observation down next to the tea and the books and the careful furnishing of her cell and began building a picture. The bunker has 3 access points, Naruto said. Each one opens from a different location in the village, and each one rotates on a different schedule. The primary access, the one I use, opens from my apartment. The secondary opens from a maintenance tunnel in the civilian water system. The tertiary is outside the village walls, in case the first 2 are compromised. Each access point is keyed to my chakra signature, which I modify on a 72-hour cycle using a rolling encryption I keep. In your head, Kurenai finished. Because writing it down would create a vulnerability. He looked at her, a beat of silence. Yes, and the bunker itself, how deep are we? 40 meters. Below the water table, below most of it. The sealed drainage system handles seepage. The ventilation network disperses through microchannels across a wide surface radius. You told me that last night. Kurenai leaned forward slightly. What you didn't tell me is why. Why what? Why any of this? Why me? Why a bunker? Why 2 years of preparation to kidnap a Jonin you've spoken to exactly twice in your life, both times in passing? She let the words sit. You don't do something like this on impulse, Naruto. You planned it the way a commander plans a campaign. So what's the objective? He was quiet for long enough that Kurenai thought he might not answer. His hands were still folded on the table, and she watched them, no tremor, no fidgeting, just the steady pressure of fingers interlaced, the only outward sign of whatever was happening behind those flat blue eyes. You have access to classified information, he said finally. Village defense protocols. Barrier team configurations. The emergency response framework for internal threats, how the village reacts when the threat comes from inside, which is different from how it reacts to external attacks. You know this because you were on the review committee 2 years ago when the protocols were last updated. Kurenai's blood chilled. He was right. She had been on that committee, a 6-month assignment to review and revise the village's internal security framework, tedious work that she'd taken because Asuma was on an extended mission, and she'd wanted something to fill the time. The committee's work was classified at the 2nd highest level. Access was restricted to the committee members, the Hokage, and Anbu Command. How do you know about the committee? She asked, and her voice was harder now, edged with something beyond personal outrage. This was a security breach. This was operational. The assignment was logged in the mission archives. Filed under administrative duties, not classified operations, because someone in the records office miscategorized it. It sat in the open filing system for 3 days before the error was caught, and the file was moved to the restricted section. He said this with the flat recitation of someone reporting a systemic failure. I read it during those 3 days. 3 days, a filing error. An entire village's internal defense framework, compromised because someone put a folder in the wrong cabinet, and a 16-year-old boy who worked in the records room happened to notice. Kurenai's mind was racing. So this is what? Espionage? You're selling information to another village? No. Then what do you want with the defense protocols? I want to understand them. Why? He looked at her, and for the first time since she'd been in this room, she saw something move behind the blankness. Not emotion, exactly, something deeper, something structural, like watching a fault line shift beneath the surface of still water. Because someday I'm going to need to know how this village protects itself, he said, and whether it's worth protecting. The words hung in the air between them, and Kurenai realized, with a clarity that felt like stepping off a cliff, that she was not dealing with a criminal. She was not dealing with a spy. She was dealing with something the village had never prepared for, because the village had never imagined it could happen. She was dealing with a boy who was deciding whether Konoha deserved to exist, and who had kidnapped her to help him make up his mind. 3 streets east of the Hawkage Tower, Asuma Sarutobi sat on the steps of the Intelligence Division building and smoked. He'd been awake for 31 hours. The cigarette tasted like ash and felt like the only thing keeping his hands from shaking, which was probably true. He'd smoked more in the last day than he usually did in a week, and some detached, clinical part of his brain was noting the irony. Kurenai had been trying to get him to quit for 2 years, and now that she was gone, he was burning through packs like they owed him money. The morning briefing with Ibiki had been brutal in its efficiency. The forensic SEAL team had completed their preliminary analysis of the pit site. Their findings were spread across Ibiki's desk in a series of diagrams and technical reports that Asuma only partially understood, but the summary was clear enough. The SEAL work was unlike anything in Konoha's archives. The architecture was original, self-consistent, and showed a depth of theoretical understanding that put it in a category with maybe 5 or 6 living practitioners. None of those practitioners had any reason to kidnap Kurenai. Jiraiya was outside the village. The SEAL Corps master was 73 and barely left his workshop. The Anbu SEAL specialists were all accounted for. "We're looking for someone new," Ibiki had said, tapping the technical diagrams with one scarred finger. "Someone who developed this independently." And based on the scale of the operation, the site preparation, the countermeasures, the level of intelligence gathering required to target a specific Jonin on a specific route, we're looking at months of planning minimum. Probably longer. Inside or outside? Asuma had asked. He already knew the answer, but he needed to hear someone else say it. Inside. The operational knowledge required, patrol schedules, response protocols, forensic countermeasures specific to our tracking methods, points to someone with intimate familiarity with Konoha's security infrastructure. Either an active shinobi or someone with access to restricted operational information. Inside. Someone they worked with, trained with, passed in the halls. Someone who ate at the same restaurants and walked the same streets and looked like everyone else. Asuma smoked and stared at the building across the street. A bakery, already open. The smell of fresh bread drifting across to him like a message from a world where normal things still happened. A civilian couple emerged with a bag of pastries, laughing about something, leaning into each other with the unconscious ease of people whose biggest problem was what to have for lunch. He thought about Kurenai. Not the operational Kurenai, the one on the mission boards and the classified committees, but the real one. The one who snorted when she laughed too hard. The one who fell asleep reading and left books face down all over her apartment with their spines cracked, which drove him insane. The one who made terrible coffee and excellent curry, and could dismantle a B-rank genjutsu with her eyes closed, but couldn't parallel park to save her life. The one who'd looked at him 3 years ago, sitting on the roof of this very building after a mission that had gone sideways in ways neither of them wanted to talk about, and said, very quietly, "I'm glad you're alive, you big idiot," and that had been it. That had been the moment he'd known. Not the first date or the first kiss or the first night, the moment on the roof, with the stars and the smoke and her voice in the dark, calling him an idiot like it was the most important thing she'd ever said. He finished the cigarette. Lit another. You're going to burn a hole in your lungs at that rate. Asuma looked up. Kakashi Headache was standing 3 meters away with his hands in his pockets, and his visible eye carrying the particular heaviness that meant he'd heard the news and had an opinion about it. He wore his standard uniform, his headband tilted over his Sharingan, his posture communicating the careful laziness that Asuma knew was a lie. Kakashi. Here to help or here to observe? Can't it be both? Kakashi walked closer and leaned against the railing beside the steps, not sitting, maintaining the slight elevation that was either habitual or deliberate. I heard the briefing through the wall. Ibiki's conference rooms aren't as soundproof as he thinks. What did you hear? Enough. Original seal work, deep planning, inside knowledge. Kakashi's eye tracked a pair of Chunin walking past on the street. Someone's been building this for a while. That's the consensus. I might be able to help with the seal analysis. I've studied Minato-sensei's work, not at a master level, but enough to recognize the underlying architecture. If the forensic team can give me their breakdown, I might spot something they'd miss. Asuma looked at him. Kakashi's offer was genuine. The man was many things, but insincere wasn't one of them. But there was something else there, something under the surface. A thread of tension that didn't match the lazy posture. Kakashi, is there something you're not saying? The copy ninja was quiet for a beat too long. The briefing mentioned that the seal architecture showed parallels to the Fourth's work. Independent development, not direct study. Yeah, that's a very specific technical assessment. It means the person who built these seals thinks about chakra theory the same way Minato-sensei did, not copying his methods, arriving at similar conclusions through their own path. Kakashi's eye was fixed on something in the middle distance. There aren't many people who could do that. The talent pool for that kind of intuitive seal work is small. Ibiki said maybe 5 or 6 living practitioners in the known world, but the analysis also said this person is self-taught, working without formal training or access to classified resources. That changes the profile. You're not looking for an established seal master. You're looking for a prodigy, someone with an unusual chakra capacity, an intuitive understanding of energy systems, and years of unsupervised time to develop their skills. Asuma turned the cigarette between his fingers. The cold finger was back, pressing against his spine. You have someone in mind. Kakashi didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was different, quieter, stripped of the performative ease. I have a student who I've been failing for 3 years. A student I was supposed to train and instead passed off to whoever was available because I was too focused on the Sharingan user on the team to pay attention to the other 2. A student who has the largest chakra reserves in the village by a significant margin, who carries a seal designed by Minato-sensei himself inside his body, and who I've watched get quieter and more withdrawn for the past year, while telling myself it was just adolescence. The cigarette stopped moving between Asuma's fingers. Kakashi met his eye. I'm not making an accusation. I'm identifying a possibility that I'd be negligent to ignore. And I'm telling you because if I'm right, and I desperately hope I'm not, then you deserve to hear it from me rather than find out some other way. The name sat between them, unspoken but deafening. Asuma's mind rebelled against it. He's a kid, he's 16, he's the class clown, he's nobody. But the rebellion was surface level, emotional, and beneath it. The analytical mind that had kept him alive through 2 decades of combat was running the same calculations Shikamaru had run and arriving at the same sickening conclusion. Has Shikamaru talked to you? Asuma asked. Kakashi's eye sharpened. No, why? Because he's thinking the same thing you are. They stood in silence while the morning moved around them. The bakery sold another bag of pastries. A cat crossed the street. Somewhere in the village, search teams were running grid patterns and analyzing seal residue, and doing all the things a shinobi village did when one of its own was taken. And none of them were looking at the blonde boy in the orange jumpsuit, because why would they? Why would anyone look at him? I need to check something, Kakashi said. Before we take this any further, I need to confirm or rule out before we put a name in front of Ibiki, because once that happens, it can't be undone. What are you going to check? His apartment. I know the layout. I inspected it when he was assigned to my team, standard sensei protocol. If he's been doing SEAL work at the level described in the forensic reports, there should be traces. Ink residue, practice arrays, reference materials, something. Asuma nodded slowly. Go. But Kakashi, if you find something? I'll come to you first. Kakashi straightened, gave Asuma a nod that carried more weight than any salute, and vanished with a body flicker that left a swirl of leaves settling to the steps. Asuma watched them fall, watched them go still, and then he put out his cigarette and went back inside to find Ibiki. He didn't tell Ibiki about the conversation. Not yet. Not until Kakashi confirmed. Because saying the name out loud would make it real. And real meant consequences. And consequences meant that the village was going to have to look at what it had done to a child and call it by its right name. And Asuma wasn't sure Konoha was ready for that. He wasn't sure he was ready for it either. The clock in the records room read 11:47 when Naruto finished the last filing stack of the morning and signed out for his lunch break. Takeshi and his partner had already left, Takeshi to the cafeteria. The other one to wherever he went that he thought nobody noticed was the direction of the women's bathhouse, though nobody cared enough about his midday routine to comment. Naruto walked through the Hokage Tower at a pace that matched the foot traffic around him, threading through clusters of chunin and administrative staff with the unconscious ease of someone who knew every corridor, every shortcut, every blind spot in the building's flow of movement. He nodded to a receptionist who didn't nod back. He sidestepped a genin running a delivery scroll at full tilt. He passed the mission desk, where Uruka-sensei was explaining something to a team of fresh genin with the patient intensity that was uniquely his, and Naruto felt the old familiar tug, the only real one, the one he'd never quite learned to suppress, and kept walking. Uruka was the exception. Had always been the exception. The one person in the village who had looked at him and seen something other than the fox, something other than a nuisance, something worth feeding and teaching and worrying about. Naruto had spent years trying to figure out what to do with that, how to fit one genuine human connection into a worldview that had no space for it, and he'd never found an answer that didn't hurt, so he'd left Uruka out. Out of the plans, out of the calculations, out of the cold architecture of the life he was building beneath the surface. It was the closest thing to kindness he could manage, and it wasn't close enough. He exited the tower through the east entrance and took the long way home, the route that wound through the market district and the residential blocks where nobody paid attention to one more person walking. He bought onigiri from a stall, not because he was hungry, but because it was his routine, and deviating from routine was how patterns formed, and patterns were how people got caught. The streets were tense. He could feel it in the changed quality of conversation around him, the way the shinobi he passed moved with a heightened awareness that hadn't been there yesterday, the way civilians clustered in small groups and spoke in lowered voices. The news was out. Not the details. The village leadership was controlling the information flow, releasing only that a Jonin was missing and the situation was under investigation. But the fact itself had landed like a stone in water, and the ripples were spreading. Naruto ate his onigiri and watched the ripples and felt nothing. That wasn't quite true. He felt something, a low, constant hum of attention, the operational awareness that kept him tracking variables and monitoring the environment for threats. But the emotional register was quiet. It had been quiet for a long time, ever since he'd made the decision that had led to last night, ever since he'd crossed the line between planning and execution, and found that the other side was just as still as the planning had been. He'd expected to feel something. When he'd stood at the edge of the pit and looked down at Kurenai, unconscious, vulnerable, he'd expected the moment to carry weight. Triumph or guilt or fear or something human. Instead, there had been only the clean, clinical focus of someone completing a task, checking boxes, moving to the next step. He wondered sometimes if the fox had eaten that part of him, the part that felt things at the right volume. Or if the village had starved it to death long before the fox could get to it. His apartment was 3 blocks ahead. He turned the corner, climbed the exterior stairs, reached for his door, and stopped. The hair. A single strand, blonde, that he'd placed across the seam between the door and the frame at a precise height and angle when he'd left this morning. It was gone. Not displaced, gone. Someone had opened his door and closed it again. And they'd been careful enough to check for tells, but not careful enough to replace them. Naruto stood very still. His hand rested on the doorknob, and his mind ran through the possibilities with the speed and efficiency of a system designed for exactly this kind of threat assessment. The hair was a first-layer countermeasure, the obvious one, the one that any competent shinobi would look for and disarm. Behind it were 3 other indicators, each more subtle than the last. A faint dusting of powder on the interior doorknob that would transfer to skin. A pressure-sensitive thread beneath the welcome mat. And a seal, invisible, worked into the wood of the door frame itself. That would register the chakra signature of anyone who touched it. Naruto pressed his thumb to the seal. The information came in a pulse, not words, not images, just a raw impression of the chakra that had last contacted the seal. It was familiar. He'd felt it before, in training sessions and team meetings and the long hours of waiting that made up most of a genin's existence. Kakashi. Naruto removed his thumb. He stood at his door for exactly 3 seconds, processing, recalculating, adjusting. Then he opened the door and walked in. The apartment looked untouched. Kakashi was good, one of the best, which was the problem, and he'd left everything exactly as he'd found it. The dishes in the cabinet, the calendar on the wall, the crack in the plaster above the bathroom door, nothing out of place, but he'd been here, he'd been looking. And Kakashi was not the kind of man who searched a student's apartment on a whim, which meant someone, the investigation, maybe, or Kakashi's own instincts, had pointed a finger in Naruto's direction. Faster than expected. Not dangerously so, the apartment was clean, genuinely clean, because Naruto had never done seal work here, never stored materials here, never done anything here that deviated from the cover story. But the fact that Kakashi was looking at all meant the timeline was shifting. Naruto closed the door behind him. Replaced the hair. Checked the other countermeasures. The powder had been disturbed and smoothed over, the pressure thread had been triggered and reset, all consistent with a thorough but non-destructive search. Kakashi had found nothing, because there was nothing to find, but he'd looked. That mattered. Naruto went to the kitchen, washed his hands, and made tea. He sat at the small table and drank it, and thought about Kakashi Hadake, who had been his sensei for 3 years, and had taught him almost nothing. Not out of malice, Naruto understood that now, with the clear-eyed perception that came from having given up on anger as a useful emotion. Kakashi was a broken man carrying broken things, and the sharing-in on his team had triggered something in him that made the other 2 genin invisible. Sasuke got the training, the attention, the time. Sakura got the scraps. Naruto got a pat on the head and a speech about teamwork, and the unspoken message that his role on the team was to be loud and brave and expendable. He'd learned from it. Not what Kakashi intended, not jutsu or tactics or the technical skills that a sensei was supposed to pass to his students, but the deeper lesson, the one Kakashi taught by example without knowing it. That the people who were supposed to care about you would always find a reason not to. And the only person you could rely on was yourself. It was a good lesson. It had shaped everything that came after. Naruto finished his tea, washed the cup, and went to the bathroom. He pressed his fingers to the seal behind the mirror and took the passage down. Kurenai heard him coming. Not his footsteps. The bunker's construction muffled those to nothing. But the seals on the door shifted their frequency a fraction of a second before it opened, and she'd been listening for exactly that, cataloging the subtle changes in the ambient seal hum that preceded his arrivals. Her second visit. Already building a pattern, the door opened. Naruto stepped through, and this time Kurenai was standing, positioned near the bookshelf with a volume of Genjutsu theory open in her bound hands. A deliberate choice, she wanted him to see her reading one of the books he'd selected for her, because accepting the resources he'd provided established a channel of exchange. You give me something, I use it. Now we're in a relationship. Now there's a dynamic I can work with, he noticed. She saw his eyes track the book, register which one it was, file the information. Good. I've been thinking about what you said, Kurenai told him. She kept her voice even, conversational. Teacher to student, a frame she was choosing deliberately, one that established authority and precedence. About the defense protocols, about deciding whether the village is worth protecting. Naruto closed the door behind him. He was carrying no tray this time. His hands were empty, hanging at his sides. He leaned against the wall near the door, maintaining distance. And I think you're lying to yourself. No reaction. The flat blue eyes stayed fixed on her. The defense protocols are real, she continued. I believe you want that information, and I believe you've been planning to get it for a long time, but that's not why. That's the justification. That's the story you tell yourself, so that what you did last night makes sense as a strategic operation instead of what it actually is. She set the book down on the shelf, turned to face him fully. You didn't kidnap me for intelligence, Naruto. You kidnapped me because you wanted someone to talk to. The silence that followed was the loudest thing she'd ever heard. Naruto didn't move, didn't speak. But something happened in his face. Not a crack, not a break, more like a tremor, a seismic event so deep that only the most sensitive instruments would register it. A shift in the muscles around his eyes, a fractional tightening of his jaw, a change in the quality of his stillness from controlled to held. Kurenai pressed. The books, the tea, the careful furnishing of this room, designed not just to contain me, but to make me comfortable. The way you explain things to me, the seals, the access points, the ventilation, you're not sharing intelligence. You're showing off. You're saying, look what I built, look what I can do, look at me. Stop. The word came out different from everything else he'd said to her. Not flat, not controlled, but sharp, a crack in the veneer that she felt like a physical impact. She'd hit something. A nerve, a wound, a fracture line that ran deeper than either of them could see. She stopped. Not because he told her to, but because pushing too hard too fast would close the opening instead of widening it, and she was playing a long game. I'm not going to apologize for seeing clearly, she said, softer now. That's what I do. It's what I've always done. You can seal my chakra and take my weapons, but you can't turn off my eyes. Naruto was breathing differently. Faster, though he was trying to control it. She could see the deliberate effort, the way he pulled air through his nose and released it slowly, the self-regulation of someone who'd had a lot of practice managing reactions he didn't want to have. You don't know me, he said. I know what this room says about you. I know what the tea says about you. I know what the fact that you're standing here, having this conversation, instead of extracting the information by force says about you. Maybe I'll get to the force. You won't. He looked at her. Really looked, the way he had last night, with that attention that had weight and mass and a quality she could only describe as hungry. Not threatening, not predatory. The hunger of someone who hadn't eaten in so long they'd forgotten what food tasted like, but their body remembered. You're very sure of yourself for someone in a box, he said. I'm a Genjutsu master. Boxes are where I do my best work. Something moved across his face, quick, involuntary, barely there. Not a smile, not even close, but a response, a flicker of something alive behind the wall. Then the wall came back, and he was still again. The defense protocols, he said. The barrier team configurations, the emergency response framework. I need that information. Why? Because knowledge is the only currency that's ever been worth anything to me, and I don't have enough of it yet. Enough for what? He pushed off the wall, straightened, and moved to the door. The conversation was over. She could feel him closing it down, pulling the mask back into place, reassembling the architecture of control that she'd managed to crack for exactly 15 seconds. I'll bring dinner at 6, he said. Think about what I asked. I haven't agreed to give you anything. He paused at the door, didn't turn around. I know, that's why I'm giving you time. The door sealed behind him, and Kurenai stood alone in the amber light with her heart hammering and her mind on fire. She'd gotten through. For a moment, brief, fragile, already gone, she'd reached past the mask and the planning and the cold architecture and touched something real. Something broken and hungry and desperately, frighteningly human. She sat down at the table and pressed her bound hands against the wood and breathed until her pulse slowed. Then she picked up the Genjutsu theory text and opened it to where she'd left off. She had time. He'd given her time, which meant she had time to work. And the work was clear now, clearer than the defense protocols, clearer than the investigation she couldn't contribute to, clearer than anything she'd done in her career. She was going to take this boy apart. Not with violence, not with manipulation, but with the only tool she had that his seals couldn't suppress. The truth. Kakashi was waiting on the steps of the intelligence building when Asuma came out at 3 in the afternoon. And the fact that Kakashi was early for anything told Asuma everything he needed to know about what the man had found. Clean, Kakashi said, before Asuma could ask. The apartment is completely clean. No seal materials, no ink residue, no practice arrays, no technical references. Nothing that connects him to any of it. Asuma exhaled. The relief was immediate, and then it curdled because Kakashi's tone didn't match the words. He was reporting a negative result the way someone reported a confirmed threat. But, Asuma said, the apartment was too clean. No personal effects, no photographs, no decorations, no accumulated stuff of a life. The place looks exactly the way it did when I inspected it 3 years ago, minus some food in the kitchen. A 16-year-old boy has been living there for years, and there's no evidence of it. No growth, no change, no personality. Maybe he's just neat. He's not. Or at least, the version of him we see isn't. The Naruto I know leaves ramen cups everywhere and can't find his own equipment. That person and the person who lives in that apartment are not the same person. Asuma felt the cold finger again. It was becoming familiar. That's not proof. No. It's not, but it's a data point and it lines up with the others. Kakashi leaned against the railing, and for once he didn't look lazy. He looked tired and old and weighed down by something that had nothing to do with gravity. I also checked the building entry logs. Naruto's apartment building has a civilian superintendent who keeps records of who comes and goes. Basic security, nothing sophisticated. According to those records, Naruto left his apartment at 2100 last night and didn't return until 0300. Asuma stared at him. Kurenai's last check-in was at 2200, Kakashi continued. He was out during the window. That's still circumstantial. Half the village was out at 2100, but combined with the seal analysis, the operational profile, the access to the duty board. It's not enough to bring to Ibiki? No, but it's enough to watch him. Kakashi paused. I'm going to start paying attention. Real attention, not the half-assed version I've been giving him for 3 years. If he's doing what I think he might be doing, he has to have a supply chain, seal materials, food, equipment. That stuff doesn't appear out of nothing. He's getting it from somewhere. And if Shikamaru finds something in the access logs, then we'll have 2 threads pointing the same direction, and that starts to look like a rope. Asuma nodded. He felt sick, a deep, gut-level nausea that had nothing to do with food and everything to do with the dawning recognition that they might be hunting a child. A child the village had broken. A child who had been his student's classmate, his lover's neighbor, a face in the crowd that nobody had bothered to really see. Kakashi, he said. If it's him, if it's really him, what do we do? Kakashi was quiet for a long time. A breeze moved through the street, carrying the smell of bread from the bakery and the sound of children playing somewhere out of sight. The village moved around them, normal and alive and completely unaware. I don't know, Kakashi said. I don't know what we do, but we find her first. Everything else comes after. Asuma lit a cigarette. This time, Kakashi didn't comment. On the other side of the village, in the Hyuga compound, Hinata Hyuga sat in her room with her knees drawn up and her Byakugan active, and her gaze pointed in a direction she'd been looking for longer than she wanted to admit. She could see him from here. Not clearly, the Byakugan's range at this distance gave her a general outline, a chakra signature she'd memorized years ago, the bright impossible beacon of the nine tails layered beneath the steady blue of Naruto's own energy. He was in his apartment, sitting at his table, drinking tea normal. Completely normal, except Hinata deactivated her Byakugan and pressed her face against her knees and tried to put words to the thing that had been growing in her chest for months. It wasn't concern exactly, though concern was part of it. It wasn't the old childhood crush, which she'd long since recognized for what it was, a projection of her own loneliness onto someone else's, a mirror rather than a window. It was something colder and more precise. She'd been watching him. Not the way she used to, with shy glances and burning cheeks and the breathless hope that he might look back. This was different. This was the observation of someone who had trained her eyes to see through deception, through camouflage, through layers of misdirection, and who had noticed that the boy she'd spent years admiring was disappearing, not physically. He was there every day at the training grounds, at the mission desk, at Ikaraku's, in the streets. Present, visible, loud, but the substance of him was thinning, like a painting left in the sun, the colors fading while the frame stayed intact. His laugh had changed. His movements had changed. The way he occupied space had changed, and she couldn't explain how she knew this, except that she'd spent so many hours watching him that the baseline was burned into her perception, and the deviations were screaming at her. He was quieter when he thought no one was looking. His eyes went flat. His posture shifted from open and energetic to something compact and watchful, the stance of someone conserving energy for something they hadn't done yet. And then there were the absences. Small ones, an hour here, 2 hours there, gaps in his visible routine that she'd noticed because she noticed everything about him, even now, even after the crush had matured into something more complicated and less comfortable. He would be at Ikaraku's at 7 and then just not be anywhere. Not at home, not at training, not at any of the places he was supposed to be. Gone, like a coin slipping between the cushions of the world. She'd activated her Byakugan during one of those absences 3 months ago. Scanned for his chakra signature across her range. And she'd found it, faint, attenuated, as if it were coming through layers of interference below. Not at ground level. Below ground, in a direction and at a depth that didn't correspond to any known structure or tunnel system. She hadn't told anyone. She should have told someone. Now a Jonin was missing, and the village was searching, and Hinata sat in her room with her knees against her chest, and the knowledge pressing against the inside of her ribs like a bird trying to break through bone. She didn't know what she knew. That was the problem. She had fragments, observations, anomalies, pieces of a picture that she couldn't assemble because the image they formed was something she wasn't ready to see. Naruto was her first acknowledgement of another person's pain, the first time she'd looked at someone else and thought, "I see you." The idea that the person she'd seen might not be the person who was actually there, that her seeing might have been as much illusion as everyone else's blindness, was a crack in something foundational, but the Jonin was missing. And Hinata was a shinobi. And shinobi didn't get to hide from things that hurt. She stood up, crossed to her desk, pulled out a blank scroll and a brush, and began writing down everything she'd observed over the past 6 months. Every absence, every anomaly, every moment when the mask had slipped, and she'd glimpsed something underneath that she hadn't wanted to name. She didn't know who to give it to yet. That decision could wait until the writing was done, until the fragments were assembled, until the picture was clear enough that she could look at it and know, really know, what she was seeing. The brush moved across the paper, and the ink dried, and Hinata wrote, and outside her window the village searched for a woman who was 40 meters below its streets. In a room built by a boy who had been invisible for so long that even the person who'd watched him most carefully hadn't seen what he was becoming. At 6 o'clock, as promised, the door opened. Kurenai had been ready for an hour. She'd spent the afternoon reading, actually reading, not just performing it, because the Genjutsu theory text was genuinely excellent, and her mind needed fuel and thinking. Building the profile, refining the approach, preparing for the next conversation the way she'd prepare for a mission briefing. Naruto came in with dinner. Grilled mackerel, rice, steamed greens, miso. The quality was consistent with the previous meals, fresh, well-prepared, portioned appropriately. He set the tray on the table, pulled out his chair, and sat. She sat across from him. They looked at each other across the small table in the amber light, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "You've been thinking," Naruto said, "so have you?" A beat. He picked up his own chopsticks. He'd brought food for himself this time, 2 portions on the tray, 2 sets of chopsticks, and began eating. The gesture was significant, and Kurenai recognized it immediately. Sharing a meal was an act of normalization, a bridge-building exercise that pulled the dynamic away from captor-prisoner and toward something more human. He was doing it deliberately, but it was also, she thought, possible that he was doing it because he was tired of eating alone. She picked up her chopsticks. The mackerel was good, fresh, properly seasoned, cooked by someone who knew what they were doing. She added that to the profile. He could cook. Not survival cooking, not heat and eat, actual cooking with skill and care. Another thing he'd taught himself. Another competency hidden behind the mask of the bumbling, ramen-obsessed genin. "Your sensei searched your apartment today," she said. Naruto's chopsticks paused for a fraction of a second, then they resumed. "I know. He didn't find anything. There's nothing to find. Because you're smarter than that." He looked at her over the rim of his teacup, and she caught it again, the flicker of something alive behind the wall. Not quite pride, recognition. The experience of being seen by someone who understood what they were seeing. "But Kakashi being there at all means someone's made the connection," Kurenai continued. "The seal analysis from the pit, your access to the duty board, the profile of someone self-taught with unusual chakra capacity, it points to you. Maybe not conclusively. Not yet. But the arrow is turning in your direction. I planned for that. I'm sure you did. You've planned for everything, but plans have a shelf life, Naruto. The longer this goes on, the more variables you can't control. Kakashi is one of the best trackers alive. Ibiki Morino breaks people for a living. And Shikamaru Nara." She watched his face as she said the name, and there, a reaction, small but real, the tightening around his eyes that meant the name carried weight. "Shikamaru sees patterns, that's his gift, and you've created a lot of patterns." "I've created a lot of noise." Naruto corrected. "Patterns are signal. The pit, the seals, the false trails, those are noise. By the time they filter the signal from the noise, I'll have what I need. The defense protocols. Yes." Kurenai set down her chopsticks. "And if I don't give them to you, then we'll have a lot of dinners." It was almost funny. In a terrible, wrong, impossible way, it was almost funny, and Kurenai felt the absurdity of the situation press against her like a physical force. She was sitting in an underground bunker, eating grilled mackerel with a 16-year-old boy who had kidnapped her, and he had just made something that was very nearly a joke. She didn't laugh, but she didn't look away either. "Tell me something true," she said. "Not about the bunker. Not about the seals or the protocols or your operational timeline. Something true about you." He was quiet for a long time. The ambient hum of the seals filled the silence, and the amber light made shadows of them both on the walls, larger than life, shapes without detail. "I used to talk to the fox," he said. Kurenai went very still. "When I was young. Before I understood what it was or why people looked at me the way they did. I could feel it, not thoughts, not words, just a presence. Something else in there with me. I used to talk to it at night. Tell it about my day. What I ate for dinner. What the kids at school said. Stupid stuff." He paused. It never answered, but it listened. I could feel it listening. And for a long time, that was the only audience I had. He said it the way he said everything. Flat. Controlled. Reporting from behind the wall. But the content of the words was a different thing entirely, and Kurenai felt the impact of them land in a place she hadn't known was exposed. A child, alone in an apartment the village had given him because nobody wanted him. talking to a demon because the demon was the only thing that was there. I stopped when I was about 9, he continued. That's when I figured out what the fox was and what it meant and why the village. He stopped, set down his teacup, picked it up again. I stopped talking to it. I stopped talking to anyone, really. Not all at once, I kept the mask going for years. But underneath, I went quiet, and the quiet was where I started building. Building the bunker, building everything. The seals, the skills, the plans, the version of myself that could do what needed to be done. He met her eyes. You asked me this afternoon if I kidnapped you because I wanted someone to talk to. You were right, but you were also wrong. I don't want someone to talk to. I want someone who can tell me if the thing I'm building, the version of the world I'm working toward, makes any sense. Or if I've been alone so long that I can't tell the difference between a plan and a delusion. The words landed like stones in still water, and the ripples spread, and Kurenai sat across from the boy who had taken her freedom and asked her to be his mirror, and she thought, there it is. There's the fracture. That's where I get in, not to manipulate, not to exploit, but to understand, because understanding was the prerequisite for everything else: escape, communication, survival. And because the thing in his voice when he said, I can't tell the difference between a plan and a delusion, was the most honest thing she'd heard from anyone in years. She picked up her tea, drank. Okay, she said. Tell me about the plan. Something shifted in the room, not the air, not the light, not anything physical. The quality of the space between them changed, the way a genjutsu changed the quality of perception, subtle, pervasive, irreversible. Whatever this had been before, abduction, captivity, confrontation, it was something else now. Something that didn't have a name yet, and might never, because the categories that existed weren't built for this. Naruto looked at her. Looked at the tea in her hands, the book on the shelf, the room he'd built for her with 2 years of work, and a desperation so deep it had calcified into something that looked like patience. It's not a short story, he said. I've got time. You made sure of that. Another flicker. Faint, fragile, there and gone. Then he began to talk in the Hokage's office. The evening reports came in like tide. Hiruzen sat behind his desk and read them one by one, pipe smoke curling around his head, and each report was another weight on a pile that was already crushing him. The forensic seal analysis was complete. The arrays recovered from the pit were, as the preliminary assessment had suggested, original work of extraordinary sophistication. The SEAL Division's conclusion was unequivocal. The architect was self-taught, operating outside any known tradition, and possessed a theoretical understanding of chakra-seal interaction that placed them in the top tier of practitioners worldwide. The duty board access logs had been compiled. 47 accesses in the relevant timeframe, all accounted for, except one. A single access from a support staff terminal in the records room, logged at 0600 4 days before the abduction, under a generic credential shared by 3 filing assistants. 3 filing assistants. Hiruzen looked at the names and felt the coal in the back of his mind flare to something hotter. The first was a 50-year-old civilian with no shinobi background. The second was a 22-year-old Chunin who'd been on medical leave the day of the access, according to hospital records. The third was Naruto Uzumaki. Hiruzen set the report down. He removed his pipe from his mouth and placed it in its rest. He folded his hands on the desk and sat in the silence of his office, in the building his teacher had built, in the village he'd sworn to protect, and he thought about a baby, newly born. Screaming in the cold October air while the Ninetales raged, and Minato Namikaze gave his life and his son to the village in the same breath. He thought about the decisions he'd made. The orphanage. The apartment. The law forbidding anyone from speaking of the fox, which had protected nothing and isolated everything. The monthly checks he'd conducted for the first few years. Visits to the apartment, conversations with the matrons, assurances that the boy was fine, was coping, was adjusting, which had become quarterly, then biannual, then annual, then nothing. Because Hiruzen was the Hokage and the Hokage had a village to run, and the boy seemed fine. Loud, happy, Fine, fine. How long had it been since he'd actually looked at Naruto Uzumaki? Not the monthly report, not the academy grades, not the Jonin-sensei evaluations that said needs work and shows promise and adequate progress. How long since he'd sat down with the boy and asked, with genuine attention, "How are you?" He couldn't remember. The realization was like a blade between the ribs, cold and precise and utterly deserved. Hiruzen picked up the report again. Read the 3 names. Put it down. He was the Hawkage. He dealt in evidence, not premonition. The access log was circumstantial at best, a generic credential, an early morning login that could have legitimate explanations. He needed more. He needed the investigation to produce its own conclusions, untainted by the suspicions of an old man wrestling with his conscience. But the coal burned. And in the darkness behind his eyes, in the place where the things he'd failed lived and whispered, a voice that sounded like his own said, "You knew. You always knew this was possible. You just bet that it wouldn't happen and the bet is coming due." He picked up his pipe. Relit it. Pulled the smoke deep and held it, and let it out slowly, watching it dissolve against the ceiling. Then he summoned the Anbu commander and said, "I want surveillance on 3 individuals. Continuous, covert, top priority classification. No written orders, verbal authorization only, Hawkage level." The Anbu commander waited. Hiruzen gave the 3 names from the access log. All 3, because he was the Hawkage and the Hawkage was thorough and impartial and did not jump to conclusions, even when the conclusion was jumping at him. The Anbu commander vanished. Hiruzen sat alone in his office and smoked and did not sleep. And outside the window, the village lay in darkness, and 40 meters below the streets, a woman and a boy were talking. And neither the village nor the man who led it had any idea what was being said. The night deepened. The search teams rotated. Fresh eyes, fresh dogs, fresh hope that diminished with every hour that produced nothing. Asuma went home at midnight, not because he wanted to, but because Ibiki ordered it, standing in the doorway of the intelligence division with his scarred face implacable and his voice carrying the particular finality of a man who was not going to be argued with. 8 hours, Ibiki said. Sleep, eat, come back functional. If you burn out, you're no good to her. Asuma went home. Went to his apartment, which was not her apartment, which smelled like cigarette smoke and takeout containers and not like her, and stood in the dark for a long time. He didn't sleep. He sat on his bed and held his trench knives in his lap, running his thumbs along the familiar grooves of the grips, and he thought about her voice. The way she said his name, Asuma, flat, unimpressed, like she'd seen everything he was and decided to keep him anyway. The way she said "you big idiot" like it was a term of endearment. The way she said "come home safe" every time he left for a mission, always the same words, always the same tone, like she was programming it into his bones. He was going to find her. He was going to tear open whatever hole she'd fallen into and pull her out, and then he was going to hold her until neither of them could breathe. And then he was going to kill whatever had taken her. The order of operations might vary. He sat in the dark and held his knives and waited for morning. In the bunker, the conversation went on. Naruto talked, and Kurenai listened, and the amber light held steady, and the seals hummed their quiet mechanical hum. And above them, the village slept without knowing that the foundations were shifting, that something was moving in the dark below. That the child they'd thrown away was building a world of his own and had taken one of their best to show it to. She listened to him describe the plan, not all of it, not the details, but the shape of it, the architecture. How he'd spent years mapping the village's infrastructure, its weaknesses, its blind spots. How he'd built a network of sealed spaces, not just this bunker, but caches and passages and observation points woven through the underground like a second circulatory system, invisible, connected, alive. How he'd accumulated knowledge the way other people accumulated wealth, patiently, methodically, from a position so low that nobody thought to guard against it, and how all of it, the preparation, the infrastructure, the knowledge, led to a question that he couldn't answer alone. "The village is broken," he said. It was late. The tea was cold. Their trays were empty, and the space between them had contracted over hours of conversation until it felt almost normal, two people at a table talking. Almost. Not in the way most people think, not weak, not corrupt, not evil. Broken the way a bone heals wrong. The structure is there, but the alignment is off, and every step builds on the misalignment until the whole thing is walking crooked and nobody remembers what straight looked like. And you want to reset it. I want to understand if it can be reset. Or if the only option is, he stopped, breaking it again. He met her eyes. Yes, Kurenai held his gaze, and you think I can help you answer that question. You've seen the internal structure. The defense protocols, the emergency frameworks, those aren't just tactical documents. They're a map of what the village values, what it protects, what it's willing to sacrifice. They tell you who matters and who doesn't, who gets defended and who gets thrown away. His voice didn't change pitch or volume, but the air in the room got heavier. I already know which category I'm in. I've always known. What I need to know is whether the category itself is a flaw in the system or the point of it. The question hung in the amber light, and Kurenai realized that she was sitting across from someone who was asking, with absolute sincerity, whether his own village had been designed to destroy him. And the worst part, the part that made her stomach drop and her hands go cold, was that she didn't know the answer. She knew the defense protocols. She'd helped write them. And she knew, with a certainty that sat like a stone in her chest, that Naruto Uzumaki did not appear in them as a person to be protected. He appeared as an asset to be managed, a containment scenario, a contingency plan in case the seal failed and the fox got out, Jinchuriki protocols. She'd read them, reviewed them, signed off on them, and at the time they'd seemed reasonable, necessary, the responsible approach to a potential catastrophe. Now she was sitting across from the catastrophe, and it had blue eyes and it had made her dinner, and it was asking her if it was a person or a weapon, and she couldn't give him the answer he needed, because the answer the protocols gave was the wrong one. I need to think about that, she said. Naruto nodded, not disappointed, not frustrated, patient, that terrible, terrible patience. Take your time, he said, and stood and cleared the trays and left, the door sealed. The amber light held steady. And Kurenai Yuhai, Jonin of Kano Hagakure, Jinjutsu master, member of the Village Defense Review Committee, sat in her underground cell and thought about what her village had built, and who it had built it on. And whether the boy who'd put her here was the villain of this story, or just the first person brave enough to read the ending out loud. She didn't sleep that night either. Chapter 3. The cracks between. On the fourth morning, Kurenai tried to escape. She'd been planning it since the second day, building the attempt piece by piece the way she built Jinjutsu, layer on layer, each element supporting the next, the whole thing invisible until the moment it wasn't. The key was the bathroom alcove. Specifically, the waste disposal seal at its base, which she'd been studying every time she used the facilities, tracing its edges with her fingers, mapping the array architecture through touch since her suppressed chakra couldn't sense it directly. The seal was a masterwork, like everything else in the bunker. It converted waste into inert components and channeled them through a narrow conduit in the floor, a pipe, essentially, no wider than her forearm, running downward at an angle she estimated at roughly 30 degrees. Useless as an escape route in its current form. But the seal itself was the vulnerability, because unlike the suppression arrays on the walls and ceiling, the waste disposal seal had to interact with the physical world. It had to open, briefly, cyclically, to flush the conduit, and in that moment of opening there was a gap in the containment field, a tiny gap, barely measurable. But Kurenai had spent 16 years working with Jinjutsu, and Jinjutsu was the art of doing impossible things through impossibly small openings. The suppression seals on her wrists dampened her ability to externalize chakra, to mold it, shape it, project it outward. But they didn't eliminate her internal chakra flow, because doing so would kill her. She still had chakra circulating through her system at baseline levels, maintaining her organs, her tenketsu, her basic biological functions. She couldn't use it, couldn't direct it. Unless the containment field flickered. She'd timed the disposal cycle over 2 days. Every 4 hours, the seal activated, the conduit opened, and for approximately 3 seconds, the area effect suppression in the bathroom alcove dropped by perhaps 15%. Not enough to mold a jutsu. Not enough to break the wrist seals. But enough, maybe, possibly, if she was precise and lucky and willing to burn through chakra she might not be able to replace, to push a single pulse of energy through the conduit, not an attack. Not a message. Just a ping, a burst of her unique chakra signature, traveling through the conduit, through whatever system it connected to, and emerging somewhere on the surface where a sensor might detect it. A flare in the dark, tiny and brief, but hers. Unmistakably hers. She waited until the 0600 cycle. Sat in the alcove with her back against the wall, and her bound hands resting on her knees and her eyes closed, her entire being focused inward on the faint, muffled pulse of her own chakra. She felt the suppression field shift, the almost imperceptible easing, like a hand loosening its grip, and she moved, not with her body, with everything she had left. She gathered the trickle of accessible chakra, compressed it, shaped it with nothing but willpower and 16 years of training, and pushed it downward through the soles of her feet, through the floor, into the conduit. A single concentrated pulse of Kurenai Yuhai's chakra signature blazing through the pipe like a lit match, dropped down a well. The effort nearly made her black out. The suppression seals on her wrists flared hot, punishing the unauthorized expenditure. She sagged sideways, catching herself on one hand, vision graying at the edges. Her chakra reserves, already depleted from 4 days of suppression, bottomed out with a sick, hollow feeling, like her body had been wrung dry. But the pulse was away. Somewhere above her, somewhere on the surface, her chakra was traveling through whatever drainage or utility system the conduit connected to. And if anyone was looking, if the sensor teams were still sweeping. If anyone had equipment pointed in the right direction at the right moment, the door opened, not on schedule. Not with the usual subtle shift in air pressure and the dimming of the seal arrays. The door simply opened, fast and without ceremony, and Naruto was there. He looked different. The flat composure was gone, replaced by something sharp and electric, a tension in every line of his body that she hadn't seen before. His eyes swept the room, the empty cot, the bathroom alcove where she was slumped against the wall, and she saw him process the scene in an instant. Her position, her pallor, the faint residual glow of the wrist seals, the barely perceptible change in the ambient field. "You pushed through the disposal conduit," he said. Not a question. Kurenai looked up at him from the floor and said nothing. Her vision was still gray. Her hands were shaking. Naruto crossed the room in 4 strides, crouched beside the disposal seal, and placed his palm flat on the array. His eyes went distant for 2 seconds. Reading the seal, she realized, the way she'd read a genjutsu, directly, through contact. Then his expression changed again, and this time she could read it clearly. He was impressed. 3 seconds of a 15% fluctuation, he said, almost to himself. You pushed a directed chakra pulse through a waste conduit during a 3-second window with no hand signs and depleted reserves. He looked at her. That shouldn't be possible. Surprise, Kurenai said. Her voice came out thin, wrecked. Naruto was quiet for a moment. Then he stood, left the alcove, and returned 30 seconds later with a cup of water and a blanket. He set the water within her reach and draped the blanket over her shoulders without touching her skin. Then he sat on the floor across from her, his back against the opposite wall, and folded his arms. "It won't work," he said. "The conduit feeds into a sealed processing chamber 60 meters lateral. The pulse will dissipate against the chamber's containment arrays before it reaches the surface. The drainage connection to the village utility system is routed through 3 additional sealed junctions, each one a dead end for foreign chakra." Kurenai closed her eyes. The disappointment was a physical thing, a weight that pressed down on her chest and made breathing harder than it should have been. "But," Naruto continued, and his voice had an odd quality she hadn't heard before, "you found the gap. You identified the vulnerability, devised an exploitation method, and executed it with no tools, no chakra access, and no margin for error. In 4 days. She opened her eyes. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize, not the flat nothing. Not the brief flickers of recognition she'd caught in their conversations. Something else, something that had weight and warmth and sat uncomfortably close to respect. "You're better than I expected," he said, "and I expected a lot. Untie my hands and I'll show you how much better." Almost, the corner of his mouth moved. Then the wall came back and he stood, and he was Naruto again, the composed version, the one who had plans and schedules and a face like still water. "I need to reinforce the disposal system. And the ventilation seals, because if you found one gap, you'll find others." He paused at the edge of the alcove. "This is going to take me most of the day. I'll bring breakfast before I start. Naruto," he stopped. "You said the pulse would dissipate, that it wouldn't reach the surface." Kurenai pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "You're reinforcing anyway. That means you're not as sure as you sound." He looked at her for a long beat. Then he left, and the door sealed, and Kurenai sat on the floor of the bathroom alcove with the cup of water he'd brought, and the blanket he'd draped over her, and the knowledge that she'd failed. But she'd also learned something. The gap existed. The waste disposal cycle created a window. He was going to close it, but the fact that it had been there at all meant the bunker wasn't perfect. It was extraordinary, it was sophisticated, it was the work of a genuine prodigy. But it was also the work of one person, working alone with no peer review, no second set of eyes, no one to catch the things he'd missed. He'd built a masterpiece. But masterpieces had flaws because the people who built them were human, and humans made mistakes, especially when they'd never had anyone to tell them so. Kurenai drank the water, waited for her chakra to stabilize, and began looking for the next gap. Above the village, the morning broke gray and heavy, the October sky packed with clouds that couldn't decide whether to rain. Asuma was at the intelligence division by 0700, showered and fed and running on 4 hours of sleep that had felt more like lying in the dark with his eyes closed while his brain refused to shut up. Ibiki met him in the briefing room with coffee, and a face that said the coffee was the good news. The SEAL division finished their deep analysis overnight, Ibiki said, sliding a folder across the table. "I need you to read this before the rest of the team arrives." Asuma opened the folder. "Read the first page, read it again." The analysis had isolated 12 distinct SEAL arrays from the pit site, each one more complex than the last. The surface-level arrays, the tripwire trigger, the suppression tag, the chakra erasure field, were what the team had been focusing on. But beneath them, embedded in the structure of the pit walls themselves, were deeper layers that the initial sweep had missed. Those deeper layers told a story. The ink used in the arrays was custom formulated, a mix of standard SEAL ink, mineral compounds from Fire Country volcanic soil, and trace elements that the analysis team identified as biological. Specifically, blood. Small quantities, integrated into the ink at the molecular level, creating a compound that bonded with chakra more efficiently than standard materials. Blood-infused SEAL ink was not unheard of. The Uzumaki clan had used it in their most advanced work before their village was destroyed and their knowledge scattered. The technique was rare, classified, and not taught in any existing curriculum, but the blood in the ink wasn't the important part. The important part was the chakra signature embedded in the biological component. Assumer read the signature analysis. Read the match confidence rating. Read it a third time, because his eyes kept sliding off the conclusion the way water slides off glass, his brain refusing to let the information land. The match confidence was 94.7%. The signature belonged to a known individual in Konoha's chakra registry, Naruto Uzumaki. Asuma closed the folder. Set it on the table. Placed both hands flat on either side of it and stared at the surface of the table and felt the world rearrange itself around a new axis. "It's him," Ibiki said, Asuma couldn't speak. The words were there, he could feel them, crowding the back of his throat, but between the feeling and the saying was a gulf he couldn't cross. Because saying it would make it true, and true meant that a 16-year-old boy, a child, had taken Kurenai and was holding her somewhere beneath the village they'd both sworn to protect. The match isn't absolute, Ibiki continued. 94.7 leaves room for doubt, and the biological component is degraded enough that a defense counsel could argue contamination. But combined with the duty board access, the operational profile, and Kakashi's observations about the apartment, it's enough. More than enough for a formal investigation. He's 16. Asuma's voice came out scraped raw. He's a kid, Ibiki. He's a Jinchuriki with unsupervised access to the largest chakra reserve in the known world, advanced sealing capabilities that rival the fourth Hokage's, and apparent motive to target a member of the Village Defense Review Committee. His age is relevant to sentencing, not to the investigation. Ibiki said it without cruelty. He said it the way he said everything, precisely, cleanly, with the professional detachment of a man whose job was to look at ugly truths and describe them accurately. But Asuma heard the subtext. Ibiki wasn't dismissing the horror of it. He was compartmentalizing it, because that's what you did when the alternative was paralysis. "What's the next step?" Asuma asked. "We bring it to the Hokage. He authorizes surveillance, formal, expanded, with the full weight of the intelligence division behind it. We track the boy's movements, his supply chain, his patterns. We find the bunker. We find Kurenai. And if we spook him, if he realizes we're onto him and—" Asuma couldn't finish the sentence. The possibilities that lived at the end of it were things he couldn't look at directly. "That's why we do this carefully. No confrontation, no tip-offs, no deviation from normal behavior. As far as Uzumaki knows, we're still chasing foreign agents and dead-end leads. We keep it that way until we have eyes on the bunker." Asuma nodded. Mechanical, automatic. The functioning part of him was following the logic, agreeing with the procedure, doing what needed to be done. The rest of him was somewhere else, standing in a training ground 3 years ago, watching a loud blonde kid in an orange jumpsuit charge headfirst at a target post and miss by a mile and get up laughing. He'd laughed at the kid. Everyone had laughed at the kid. That was the point, wasn't it? That was the whole goddamn point. The Hokage took the news the way old men took confirmation of things they'd already known. Quietly, with a stillness that was worse than any reaction, because it meant the reaction had already happened, somewhere inside, where nobody could see it. Hiruzen sat behind his desk and read the seal analysis and the duty board correlation and Kakashi's apartment report and the surveillance recommendation. And when he was done, he set the papers down and removed his pipe and held it in his lap with both hands. Like something fragile he was trying not to break. "I've already authorized surveillance on 3 individuals connected to the duty board access," he said. "Uzumaki is one of them. As of this morning, 2 Anbu teams are rotating coverage." Ibiki inclined his head. "Good. I'd recommend expanding to include his known associates, Team 7, primarily. If he's maintaining a cover, he's interacting with them regularly. Any changes in his behavior around his teammates could provide early warning." "Kakashi is aware of the suspicion," Asuma said. "He came to me independently." Hiruzen's eyes sharpened. "How independently?" He drew the same conclusions from the seal analysis. The parallel to the fourth's work, the self-taught profile, the chakra capacity requirement. He searched Naruto's apartment on his own initiative, found it clean. "Because there's nothing there," Ibiki said. "The boy's operational security is exceptional. If he's been planning this for as long as the evidence suggests, his surface life will be airtight. We're not going to catch him through his apartment or his daily routine. We need to find the supply chain." "Explain." Ibiki leaned forward. "The bunker, wherever it is, requires materials. Seal, ink, construction supplies, food stores, water, ventilation components. The custom ink alone would require volcanic soil from specific regions and biological components that need processing. These things have to come from somewhere. They have to be purchased, transported, and stored. And a 16-year-old genin working a records room job doesn't have the financial resources to fund that kind of operation through legitimate channels. He could be stealing, Asuma said. Possibly. But theft at that scale leaves traces. Inventory discrepancies, supply chain anomalies. I'll have my people run an audit of village stores, specifically seal materials, construction supplies, and preserved food stocks. If there are patterns of loss that correlate with Uzumaki's access or schedule, we'll find them. Hiruzen nodded slowly. Do it. And Ibiki, this stays contained. The investigation team, Kakashi, and the people in this room, no one else. If word gets out that we're investigating the Jinchuriki for the kidnapping of a Jonin, the political consequences will be, I understand. I'm not sure you do. Hiruzen's voice hardened, not with anger, but with the weight of a man who could see dominoes falling in a line that stretched to the horizon. If this becomes public before we recover Kurenai, we lose control of the narrative. The civilian council will demand the boy's execution. The Shinobi Corps will fracture along lines that have been there since the Fourth's death. And every foreign intelligence service with assets in this village will have confirmation that Konoha's Jinchuriki is compromised. The room was silent. We find her, Hiruzen said. We find her first, and we find her alive, and then we deal with the rest. Is that clear? It was clear. Asuma and Ibiki left. Hiruzen sat alone in his office, and the morning light came through the window gray and cold, and the pipe sat unlit in his lap. And the old man who had led the village through wars and crises and decades of fragile peace stared at the wall and saw nothing. Then he opened his desk drawer, pulled out a photograph, and looked at it. It was old. Faded. A young man with blonde hair and bright blue eyes, grinning at the camera with the incandescent confidence of someone who believed, genuinely and completely, that the world could be good. Minato Namikaze, age 20, newly appointed Jonin, a lifetime away from the night that would end him and begin his son. I'm sorry, Hiruzen said to the photograph. I'm sorry I wasn't enough. The photograph didn't answer. Photographs never did. He put it back in the drawer and closed it and picked up his pipe and went back to work, because the village didn't stop needing him just because he'd failed. Naruto spent 7 hours reinforcing the bunker's containment systems. He moved through the passages with the fluid efficiency of someone who knew every centimeter of the space, which he did, because he'd built every centimeter of it. Carved it from the earth with jutsu and sweat, and the particular stubbornness that was the only personality trait the mask and the reality shared. The disposal conduit was his first priority. He reworked the cycling mechanism, eliminating the fluctuation window entirely by redesigning the seal to maintain constant suppression even during the flush cycle. It cost him efficiency. The disposal process would be slower now, less elegant, but elegance was a luxury he couldn't afford. The ventilation seals came next. He'd been proud of them. The microchannel dispersal system was genuinely innovative, one of the best pieces of engineering he'd ever done. But Kurenai's exploit of the disposal cycle had opened his eyes to a category of vulnerability he'd underestimated. She didn't need a big gap. She needed any gap at all, and she had the skill and the determination to use it. He had to admit it, shaken, not by the escape attempt itself. He'd war-gamed scenarios like this during the planning phase, had built contingencies and countermeasures and backup systems specifically for the possibility that his captive would be more resourceful than expected. What shook him was the execution, the precision of it. The fact that she'd identified a vulnerability he'd missed, devised an exploitation method that was theoretically sound, and carried it out with nothing but baseline chakra and raw skill. She was better than he'd expected. He'd known she was good. You didn't kidnap a Jonin because you thought they were mediocre. But the gap between good and what she'd just demonstrated was the gap between a campfire and a forest fire. She was operating on a level that his plans hadn't fully accounted for, which meant his plans needed to change. He worked through the afternoon, moving from system to system, checking every seal, every conduit, every junction point where the bunker's containment interacted with the outside world. He found 2 more potential vulnerabilities, not as exploitable as the disposal cycle, but present, and he closed them with the methodical thoroughness of someone who'd just learned the hard way that probably fine was a category that could kill you. While he worked, he thought about her. Not strategically. Not the way he'd been thinking about her for 14 months. The operational thinking, the target profiling, the cold calculus of capabilities and vulnerabilities. He thought about her the way he thought about very few things. Directly, without the buffer of analysis, without the protective distance of planning. She'd looked at him from the floor of the bathroom alcove with her chakra depleted, and her body shaking and her eyes completely undefeated. And she'd said, "Untie my hands, and I'll show you how much better." And he'd felt something crack in the place where he kept the things he couldn't afford to feel. He didn't want to feel it. Feeling things was dangerous. He'd learned that lesson so early and so thoroughly that it was encoded in his bones. Feeling things made you visible, made you vulnerable. Made you the kind of person who could be hurt, which meant the kind of person who would be hurt, because the world was full of people who hurt you and empty of people who didn't. But she'd pushed chakra through his disposal conduit with no hands and no reserves and no chance of success. And she'd done it anyway, because she was Kurenai Yuhai, and Kurenai Yuhai did not stop fighting. He thought about the conversations they'd had. The way she listened, not passively, not politely, but with the active, aggressive attention of someone who was taking everything in and building something with it. The way she asked questions that landed like kunai, precise and targeted, aimed at the places he didn't want to look. The way she'd said, "You kidnapped me because you wanted someone to talk to and been right and wrong at the same time," in proportions he still couldn't sort out. He thought about the plan, the defense protocols, the question he'd told her about, whether the village is worth protecting, and the longer conversation they'd had that first night, the one about broken bones and crooked walking, and the categories that determined who mattered and who didn't. She hadn't given him the protocols. Hadn't agreed to discuss them in detail, hadn't offered the classified information he'd said he needed. But she'd done something else, something he hadn't anticipated, something that didn't fit into the operational framework. She'd listened. And then she'd pushed back. Not with refusal, not with anger, but with questions of her own, questions that turned his certainties sideways and made him look at them from angles he'd never considered. Is destroying a broken thing the same as fixing it? What happens to the people inside when you break the structure they live in? Have you thought about what comes after, or only about what comes next? He hadn't had answers. For the first time in years, since he'd started building, started planning, started constructing the architecture of the future he was working toward, he hadn't had answers, and the absence was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. Naruto finished the last seal reinforcement, checked it twice, and went to the surface. He had 2 hours before he needed to bring her dinner. 2 hours to be the other version of himself, the loud one, the visible one, the one who walked through the village and smiled at people and was exactly boring enough that no one looked twice. He came up through the apartment passage, sealed it behind him, and checked his countermeasures. The door hair was intact. The powder was undisturbed. The pressure thread was untripped, but the chakra-sensing seal in the door frame registered a second contact since this morning. The same signature as before. Kakashi, again. Naruto stood very still, his hand on the door frame, and processed. Kakashi had been here twice in 2 days. The first time could have been curiosity, a sensei checking on a student during a village-wide crisis. The second time was investigation. He was being watched. The realization didn't panic him. Panic was a luxury he'd abandoned along with hope and trust, and all the other soft things that made a person easier to break. Instead, the realization sharpened him, tightened the focus, engaged the operational part of his mind that ran on analysis and contingency and the cold clarity of a system under threat. He ran through the variables. Kakashi's visits. The seal analysis from the pit. He'd left decoy trails, but the blood ink was a potential vulnerability. He'd used minimal quantities, degraded the biological component, taken every precaution, but 94.7% was 94.7%, and if the SEAL division had gotten that far, the investigation was closer than his timeline allowed. He needed to accelerate, not the extraction of information from Kurenai. That was a process, not an event, and rushing it would break the fragile dynamic they'd built. But the contingency plans, the exit strategies, the preparations he'd made for the scenario in which the village figured out who he was before he was ready to act. Naruto changed into his orange jumpsuit, fixed the mask on his face, the grin, the squint, the slightly vacant brightness, checked himself in the cracked mirror. The boy looking back was harmless, stupid, loud. He opened the door and stepped into the afternoon, 3 rooftops to the northeast, behind a water tank on the civilian apartment block. An Anbu operative in a hawk mask tracked his movement through a long-range scope and noted the time. Shikamaru found it at 15:42. He'd been in the supply depot basement for 6 hours, going through procurement records with the grim patience of someone who'd rather be doing literally anything else, but couldn't stop because the logic wouldn't let him. The audit was Ibiki's idea. Check village stores for inventory discrepancies that might indicate unauthorized acquisition of SEAL materials. But Shikamaru had gotten there first, through a different route, because Shikamaru's mind didn't follow the same paths as other people's minds. He wasn't looking at SEAL materials. He was looking at food. The logic was simple. If someone was keeping a prisoner in an underground bunker, they needed to feed that prisoner. The bunker's location was unknown, which meant the food wasn't being delivered, it was being stockpiled. And stockpiling food required either purchasing it in bulk, which left a financial trail, or acquiring it in small quantities over a long period, which left a pattern. Naruto Uzumaki worked in the records room. He had access to the administrative wing. And the administrative wing shared a building with the Hawkage Tower Commissary, which supplied food to shinobi on extended assignments. The commissary records were meticulous. They had to be, because the accounting department audited them quarterly. Every requisition was logged. Item, quantity, requisitioner, authorization code, date. Shikamaru had pulled 2 years of logs and spread them across the basement floor like a map. The pattern was there. Small, subtle, buried in the noise of hundreds of legitimate requisitions, but there. Once every 2 weeks, a requisition appeared under a generic administrative authorization code, the kind used for interdepartmental supply transfers. The items were unremarkable rice, preserved fish, tea, cooking oil, basic staples. Small quantities, never enough to trigger an audit flag. The requisitioner field was blank, which should have been caught by quality control but wasn't, because the quantities were too small to matter and the authorization code was valid. 2 years of biweekly requisitions. 26 cycles per year. 52 total requisitions, each one pulling a small amount of food from the commissary stores under a valid but unattributable code. It was elegant. It was patient. It was exactly the kind of operation that a person with access to the administrative systems and a talent for invisibility could run indefinitely without detection. Shikamaru sat on the basement floor surrounded by requisition logs and felt the pieces click into place, with the horrible, mechanical satisfaction of a puzzle completing itself into a picture you didn't want to see. He gathered the relevant records, stacked them neatly, and carried them upstairs. Asuma was in the Intelligence Division briefing room, staring at a wall map of the village with pins marking the search grid. He looked like he hadn't slept in 3 days, which was close to the truth. When Shikamaru came in and set the stack of records on the table, Asuma looked at them, then at Shikamaru. "I found the supply chain," Shikamaru said. "Commissary records. 2 years of unauthorized food requisitions under a generic admin code. Small quantities, regular intervals, no attribution. The code is accessible from any terminal in the administrative wing." Asuma picked up the top sheet, read it. His face didn't change, but his hand trembled slightly, a vibration so fine that most people wouldn't have noticed it. But Shikamaru noticed everything, especially when it came to people he cared about. This doesn't prove it's him, Asuma said. No. But the timing of the requisitions correlates with his shift schedule. Every one of them was placed during a window when he had access to an administrative terminal. I cross-referenced with the records room duty log. Shikamaru pulled a second sheet from the stack. And there's this. The authorization code used for the requisitions, it's a valid code assigned to the Hawkage's administrative office. But it hasn't been formally used by that office in 3 years. It's a dead code, still active in the system, but nobody's supposed to be using it. How would he have gotten it? The code assignment database is in the records room. It's not classified, it's administrative infrastructure. Anyone with access to the filing system could find it. Asuma set the papers down. He sat heavily in his chair and pressed both hands against his face and breathed, and Shikamaru watched his sensei's shoulders bow under a weight that had nothing to do with the papers on the table. Asuma-sensei. Asuma lowered his hands. I know this is bad, Shikamaru said. All of it. The whole thing, but we're close. The supply chain gives us a thread, and threads can be followed. If he's been moving food from the commissary to the bunker, he has a transport route. That route has physical touchpoints, places where he picks up the supplies, places where they enter the underground system. If we can identify even one of those touchpoints, we can find the bunker. And then what? The question wasn't operational. It was the other kind, the kind that didn't have a clean answer. Shikamaru heard it and didn't look away. Then we get Kurenai-sensei back. That's the first thing. That's the only thing that matters right now. Asuma looked at him, really looked in that way he had sometimes, the way that made Shikamaru feel seen and known and slightly uncomfortable, and nodded once. Yeah, Asuma said. Yeah, that's right. He picked up the papers and went to find Ibiki. Shikamaru watched him go, then sat down in the empty chair and stared at the wall map with its pins and grid lines and the blank spaces in between where a Jonin was hidden and a boy was unraveling, and nobody had the whole picture yet. Shikamaru thought about Naruto. Not the suspect, the classmate. The kid who'd sat 3 rows back in the academy and thrown paper airplanes, and failed every test and laughed, too loud at things that weren't funny. The kid who'd been alone at every lunch period, every festival, every village event, sitting by himself on a swing or a rooftop or the edge of a crowd, grinning like it didn't matter. Shikamaru was a genius. Everyone said so, and he'd stopped arguing because arguing was troublesome. But his genius had always been cold, analytical, detached, the kind that saw patterns in data and strategies in chaos. What it hadn't done, what he was realizing now, with a sick, dropping feeling in his stomach, was see the pattern right in front of him, a lonely kid. A hostile village. Years of isolation, neglect, casual cruelty disguised as indifference. And everyone, including the genius who sat 3 rows ahead and prided himself on seeing what others missed, had looked at that pattern and thought, that's just how it is. That's just Naruto. Shikamaru pressed his palms against his eyes and breathed. Then he got up and went back to work, because the pattern he'd missed was the past, and the pattern he'd found was the present, and the only thing he could do about either was follow it to wherever it led. The dinner conversation on the 4th night was different. Naruto brought the food, grilled chicken, rice, pickled cucumber, miso soup, and sat across from her, and for the first time, Kurenai was the one who talked. She told him about the committee. Not the classified details, not yet, not the specific protocols and configurations he'd said he needed, but the process. How the committee had been formed, who was on it, what they'd been asked to review and why. The internal threat framework hadn't been updated since the Ninetales attack. She said, 16 years. The Third wanted it modernized because the political landscape had changed, the Uchiha massacre, the tensions with sand and sound, the general increase in missing nin activity. The old framework assumed internal threats would come from identifiable sources, clan conflicts, political disputes, specific individuals with known grievances. It wasn't designed for what? Naruto's voice was steady, but she could see the attention behind it, the leaning forward quality that he managed to communicate without actually moving. For systemic threats. Threats that emerge from the structure of the village itself, rather than from individuals acting against it. The committee was supposed to address that gap, but we ran into a problem almost immediately. Which was, the village doesn't have a framework for thinking about itself as the source of the threat. Every security paradigm, every protocol, every training module assumes that threats are external or aberrant, foreign agents, traitors, criminals. There's no category for the system is producing the thing it's trying to defend against. No one on the committee could figure out how to write a protocol for that, because the moment you acknowledge the system itself is the problem. You're questioning the foundation everything else is built on. She watched him absorb this. Watched the information land and integrate, fitting into whatever architecture he was building in his mind. So the committee failed, he said. The committee produced a document. Documents aren't the same as solutions. Kurenai picked up her tea Gyokuro again, second flush, perfectly brewed, and she still hadn't decided how she felt about the fact that he kept getting it right. We updated the tactical response protocols, the barrier configurations, the communication chains, the mechanical stuff. But the foundational question, what do we do when the village itself is generating the threat? We punted on it. We wrote a note recommending further study and moved on. And the Jinchuriki protocols? The question was quiet, carefully aimed. She could feel the weight behind it, not just intellectual interest, but something personal and raw, barely contained. They were part of the review. And Kurenai set her tea down. She looked at him, at the blue eyes, the still face, the careful composure that she now understood was not control but containment, the way a dam contains a river by holding back everything at once. She made a decision. The Jinchuriki protocols classify you as a strategic asset with associated containment risks. The primary framework treats you as a weapons system. Your well-being is considered insofar as it affects the stability of the seal and the reliability of the asset. The secondary framework addresses contingencies in the event of seal failure, partial or complete. The tertiary framework, she stopped. Go on. The tertiary framework covers scenarios in which the Jinchuriki becomes a voluntary threat. Defection, insurrection, collaboration with enemy forces. She held his gaze. The recommended response for all tertiary scenarios is neutralization. The word landed in the silence and lay there, and the amber light held steady, and neither of them blinked. Neutralization, Naruto repeated. Kill on sight. The committee debated the phrasing. Some members wanted containment and rehabilitation. The majority voted for the more direct language, on the grounds that a Jinchuriki who has turned against the village cannot be reliably contained, and rehabilitation is not a realistic expectation. She kept her voice even, clinical, because the only way to deliver this was without editorializing. I voted against it, for the record. Naruto looked at her for a long time. Then he looked down at his hands, folded on the table, and he was quiet in a way that was different from his usual quiet, not controlled, not composed, just empty. The emptiness of someone who has just been told the thing they already knew in a language that makes it impossible to pretend they didn't. You voted against it, he said. Yes. Why? Because a 16-year-old boy isn't a weapons system, and kill on sight isn't a policy. It's a confession of failure dressed up in operational language. Something moved in his face. Not a crack, something deeper. A tectonic shift, the kind that happened in places too deep for the surface to register, felt only in the aftershocks that would come later. You're giving me this information, he said. The protocols, the framework, the thing I said I wanted. I'm giving you the truth, that's not the same thing. Why? Kurenai leaned forward. Because you asked me if the village is worth protecting, and I can't answer that question honestly without showing you what the village actually is. Not the version they put on the Hawkage monument, not the will of fire speeches. The real thing. The ugly, compromised, deeply flawed real thing. She held his gaze. And then I'm going to ask you a question, and I need you to answer it honestly. Naruto waited. If you saw the village as it really is, not the betrayal narrative, not the version where you're the only victim and everyone else is the enemy, but the actual, complicated, human mess of it, would that change what you're planning to do? He didn't answer immediately. She hadn't expected him to. The question was a depth charge, designed to sink past the planning and the analysis and the cold architecture, and hit the place where the real decisions lived. The place that wasn't about strategy or intelligence or operational frameworks, but about a boy who'd been alone in the dark for 16 years and was trying to figure out if the world deserved his rage or his grief. "I don't know," he said finally. "That's the first honest thing you've said to me." He looked at her, and the wall was down, not all the way, not permanently, but enough that she could see behind it. And what she saw was not a monster and not a mastermind and not a weapons system classified for neutralization. What she saw was exhaustion and confusion and a loneliness so vast it had its own gravity. "Eat your dinner," she said gently. "We'll talk more tomorrow." He picked up his chopsticks. So did she. They ate in silence, and the silence was different from every other silence they'd shared. Not confrontational, not strategic, not the silence of two people waiting for the other to make a mistake. It was just quiet. Two people eating dinner in a room underground, while above them, the village that had made them both went on without knowing that the ground beneath its feet was shifting. At 0200, in the Anbu surveillance station on the east side of the village, the operative in the hawk mask filed a routine report. Subject Uzumaki, N. Observed departing apartment at 17:30. Route: East Commercial District, Market Stalls, purchased onigiri, 2 pieces, residential block 4, returned to apartment at 18:15. No deviation from established pattern, no contact with persons of interest, no anomalous behavior observed. Subject remained in apartment for remainder of observation period. Lights extinguished at 22:00. No subsequent movement detected. The report was accurate. Naruto had walked to the market, bought onigiri, and gone home. He'd turned off his lights at 10. What the report couldn't note, because the operative didn't know, was that the apartment's lights were on a timer seal that Naruto had installed 2 years ago. Or that the passage behind the bathroom mirror opened and closed without producing any detectable chakra signature. Or that at 22:17, while the Anbu operative watched a dark and apparently sleeping apartment, Naruto Uzumaki was 40 meters below the streets, reinforcing the last of the ventilation seals and thinking about a woman who'd told him the truth about what his village thought he was worth. Kill on sight. He sat in the passage between the bunker and the surface, his back against the cool earth wall, and turned the words over in his mind the way he turned everything over. Methodically, from every angle, looking for the information he could use and the emotion he couldn't afford. Kill on sight. The village's official policy in the event that he stopped being useful and started being dangerous. Not capture, not rehabilitation, not conversation, just elimination. The removal of a variable that the system couldn't control. He'd known, of course he'd known. You didn't grow up the way he'd grown up without understanding, on a cellular level, that the people around you would destroy you if they needed to. But knowing it and hearing it said out loud, in the calm voice of a woman who'd been on the committee that wrote it, were different things. Knowing it was a scar. Hearing it was the blade that made the scar, traveling backward through time to cut him fresh, and she'd voted against it. She'd said that, unprompted, and she'd said it without emphasis, without asking for credit or gratitude, just stating it as a fact in a series of facts. I voted against it. For the record, he pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes and breathed. The plan. The plan was what mattered. The plan had a timeline and objectives and contingencies, and it didn't care about feelings, because feelings were the part of you that the world could grab and squeeze until you did whatever it wanted. He'd built the plan specifically to operate without feelings. He'd built himself to operate without feelings, and it had worked. For years, it had worked. Until 4 days ago, when he'd sat across a table from a woman who looked at him like he was a person and not a seal failure waiting to happen, and something inside him had started making sounds he didn't recognize. He lowered his hands, stood, walked the passage back to the apartment, sealed the entrance, and lay down on his bed in the dark, and the apartment was quiet, and the village was quiet, and the Anbu operative on the rooftop watched the dark windows and saw nothing, and beneath it all, 40 meters down, a woman lay awake in amber light and thought about a boy who'd been told his whole life that he was a weapon, and who was starting to wonder if that was all he was. On the 5th morning, Hinata knocked on the door of the intelligence division and asked to speak with whoever was leading the investigation into Kurenai Yuhai's disappearance. The chunin at the desk gave her the look that people always gave Hinata, the slightly dismissive assessment of someone who saw the stammer and the posture and the downcast eyes, and concluded she was wasting their time. She'd stopped letting it hurt years ago. Or at least, she'd stopped letting it show. "That's classified," the chunin said. "If you have information, you can file a report with the... I have information that's relevant to the investigation." Hinata's voice was quiet but steady. She'd practiced this conversation 3 times in her room, standing in front of the mirror, watching her mouth move. "I'd like to speak with the lead investigator, please." The chunin studied her. Something in her expression, maybe the steadiness, maybe the fact that she wasn't leaving, made him reconsider. "Wait here." He disappeared inside. 5 minutes later, a man came out, tall, scarred, with the bearing of someone who could walk through a wall by sheer force of expectation. Ibiki Morino looked down at Hinata Hyuga with the measuring gaze of a professional assessor, and Hinata looked back up at him and didn't flinch, which was harder than any jutsu she'd ever performed. "You have information," Ibiki said, "about Naruto Uzumaki?" Ibiki's face didn't change. Not a muscle, not a flicker. But the quality of his attention shifted, the way a lens shifts when it finds focus, and Hinata felt the weight of it and held steady. "Come inside," Ibiki said. He led her to a small room, bare walls, a table, 2 chairs, the kind of room designed to make people uncomfortable and then use the discomfort. Hinata sat in the chair facing the door, because Neji had taught her never to sit with her back to an exit, and folded her hands in her lap. "Tell me what you know," Ibiki said. She told him. Everything she'd written on the scroll, the behavioral changes she'd observed over 6 months, the absences, the discrepancy between the public Naruto and the private one, the moments when the mask slipped. She told him about the Byakugan observation 3 months ago, the underground chakra signature in a location that didn't correspond to any known structure. Ibiki listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for 30 seconds, an eternity in a room that small. "You've been watching him for 6 months," Ibiki said. "Why didn't you report this earlier?" The question was fair. It was also the one she'd been dreading. "Because I didn't know what I was seeing." Hinata's hands tightened in her lap. I thought he was just changing, growing up. People change, and I thought the differences I was noticing were just him becoming more himself." She paused. "And because I was afraid that if I reported it, the village would react badly. The way the village always reacts to things involving Naruto. With suspicion and fear and the assumption that whatever's wrong is his fault. And now a Jonin is missing, and the things I noticed might be connected, and keeping quiet because I'm afraid of what happens next is not. It's not acceptable. Not for a shinobi, not for someone who..." She stopped, swallowed. "Not for someone who cares about him." Ibiki studied her. "You care about him." "I've watched him be alone for as long as I can remember. I've watched the village ignore him and hate him and pretend he doesn't exist. And I've watched him smile through all of it, and I thought that smile was real, and if it wasn't, if the person I've been watching was never really there." Her voice cracked, and she let it crack, because trying to suppress it would take energy she needed for other things. "Then I missed something important, and I need to help fix it." Ibiki was quiet again. Then he nodded, a single, decisive motion that carried an approval she hadn't expected. "The underground location," he said. "Can you give me coordinates?" "I can do better than that. I can show you." Hinata activated her Byakugan. The veins around her eyes surged, and the walls of the room dissolved into the layered transparency of her bloodline, structures, and chakra signatures, and the vast, complex topography of the village spreading out around her in every direction. She focused downward. Through the floor, through the earth and stone and the utility tunnels and the water table and the layers of compressed sediment that made up the village's foundation. There, she said, and pointed at a specific angle and depth. 40 meters below ground, bearing southwest from this location. There's a sealed space. I can see the edges of it. The containment arrays create a kind of shell that my Byakugan reads as a void. I can't see inside, but I can see the shape. It's roughly 5 meters by 4. And there are passages connecting to it, narrow, sealed, at least 3 that I can detect. Ibiki leaned forward. Can you see if anyone's inside? Hinata pushed her Byakugan to its limit. The sealed space resisted. The containment arrays were specifically designed to block visual and sensory penetration, which she recognized now as a deliberate countermeasure against her clan's Kekkei Genkai. But the arrays weren't perfect. At the edges, where the containment field met the surrounding earth, there were seams, hairline imperfections in the coverage that let tiny slivers of information through. She focused on those seams, narrowing her vision to a thread, pushing through the gap the way a river pushes through a crack in a dam. I can see chakra signatures, she said. Faint, distorted by the containment field, but there are 2. One is, she concentrated. One is muted, suppressed. The network is intact, but the output is nearly 0, like someone with full tenketsu who can't externalize. The other is, she stopped, her eyes widened. The other is massive, layered, 2 signatures overlapping, one human, one, she swallowed, one not. I've only seen that kind of dual signature once before, at the Chunin exams. Ibiki's chair scraped back as he stood. You're certain? There are 2 people in that space. One of them is a Jonin under chakra suppression. The other is the Jinchuriki of the 9-tailed fox. Ibiki was already at the door. Stay here. Don't talk to anyone. He left. Hinata deactivated her Byakugan and sat in the small bare room and pressed her hands together in her lap and breathed. Outside the door, she could hear rapid footsteps, low, urgent voices, the sound of an organization shifting from investigation to action. She'd done it. She'd given them what they needed. And somewhere beneath her feet, 40 meters down, a boy who'd been invisible for 16 years was about to be seen. Chapter 4. What the village-built Kurenai had been counting heartbeats. It was the only reliable measure of time she had left, now that the disposal cycle she'd been using as a rough clock had been redesigned into something seamless and unreadable. So she counted. Resting heart rate, 62 beats per minute. She'd verified it years ago during a medical evaluation and trusted her body to hold the baseline unless something pushed it higher. 62 beats, 3,720 per hour, 89,280 per day. She was somewhere around beat 240,000 when the pattern broke. Not her heartbeat, his. The rhythm of Naruto's visits, which had settled over 5 days into something she could predict. Breakfast between what she estimated was 0700 and 0800, a brief check-in around midday, dinner between 1800 and 1900. 3 contacts per day, each one a window she'd been using to study him, to build the profile, to widen the cracks she'd found in his architecture. He was late. Not by minutes, she'd have dismissed that. By hours. The midday check-in hadn't happened. Dinner hadn't happened. She was deep into what she calculated was the evening, maybe 2100 or later, and the door hadn't opened. Kurenai sat at the table with the Genjutsu theory text open in front of her and thought about what lateness meant. In a system as controlled as Naruto's, deviation from schedule was a signal. Either something had gone wrong on the surface, his cover compromised, a confrontation, an emergency that pulled him away from the routine, or something had changed inside him, something that disrupted the discipline that kept his operation running. She didn't know which possibility scared her more. The thought surprised her. Scared. Not for herself. The fear of her own situation had been metabolized days ago, processed through the professional machinery of her training until it became background noise, always present but no longer debilitating. This was different. This was fear about him, about what he might do if pressured. About what the village might do if they found him before she could, what? Talk him down, save him. She pressed her palms against the table and took a slow breath. She was a captive sympathizing with her captor. She knew the clinical name for it. She also knew that clinical labels were blunt instruments, and the thing happening inside her was more complicated than any textbook category. She didn't sympathize with what he'd done. She'd been clear about that with herself every day, running the inventory like a morning prayer. He took me against my will. He's holding me prisoner. My freedom is gone because of his choices. These facts are not negotiable. But the boy across the table, the one who talked about the fox and the silence and the terrible patient loneliness of teaching yourself everything because no one would teach you anything, that boy was real, and she couldn't unknow him, understanding the enemy. That's what she'd told herself on the second day. A strategic imperative. Get inside his head, find the cracks, use them to escape. But somewhere between the second day and the fifth, the strategy had gotten tangled up with something that wasn't strategic at all. Something that sat in the same space as the memory of his voice saying, "I used to talk to the fox at night," and the way he draped a blanket over her shoulders after her escape attempt without touching her skin. Kurenai closed the book and stared at the wall and waited for the door to open. It didn't. She waited longer, counted more heartbeats. The amber light held steady, unchanging, indifferent to whatever was happening above or between or inside the people it illuminated. She was approaching what she guessed was midnight when a sound she'd never heard before reached her, faint, distant, transmitted through the stone rather than the air. A vibration more than a noise. Rhythmic, rapid, getting closer. Footsteps. Running, the door opened hard. Not the smooth, seal-mediated opening she was accustomed to. This was manual, forced, the arrays overridden rather than properly cycled. Naruto half-stumbled through the doorway and caught himself on the frame, and Kurenai was on her feet before she'd made the conscious decision to stand because something was very, very wrong. He was in his dark clothes, not the orange jumpsuit. His face was bare, no mask, no grin, no performance. And he was breathing the way she'd never seen him breathe, hard and ragged, his chest heaving like he'd been sprinting. Except the passage from the apartment was 7 minutes at a walk, and Naruto was in the kind of physical condition that shouldn't have left him winded from a run. It wasn't physical exertion. It was something else. His eyes were too wide. His hands, braced on the door frame, were shaking. Not the fine tremor of fatigue, a full-body vibration, deep and structural, the kind that came from the inside out. "Naruto, what happened?" He looked at her, and for the first time since she'd been in this room, she saw him without any wall at all. No mask, no composure, no architecture. Just the raw thing underneath, and it was, God, it was young, terrifyingly young. A boy's face with a boy's fear in it, stripped of every defense he'd spent years building. "They know," he said, Kurenai's breath caught. "Anbu, surveillance team. They've been on me since this morning. I spotted the rotation when I left for work, confirmed it on the way home. 2 operatives, hawk and crane masks, trading off in 4-hour shifts. They're watching the apartment." "Okay, sit down." "I can't sit down. Naruto, sit down." Something in her voice, the command authority, the Jonin steel, the particular frequency that she'd spent years learning to deploy in exactly this kind of situation, cut through whatever was spiraling inside him. He moved to the chair and sat, and his hands went to the table and pressed flat, the way hers did, and she realized with a jolt that he'd picked up the gesture from her. 5 days of watching her ground herself, and he'd absorbed it without knowing. She sat across from him. The table between them, the same table where they'd shared every meal, every conversation, every careful exchange of truth and misdirection. She kept her voice steady. "Tell me everything. From the beginning of the day," he told her. The morning shift at the records room, normal, nothing unusual, the mask in place, the filing done. The walk to work, where he'd caught the first shadow, an Anbu operative on a rooftop, positioned for long-range visual surveillance, using a scope. Standard technique. He'd noted it and kept walking, because acknowledging surveillance was the fastest way to confirm it. The walk home, where he'd identified the second operative, different mask, different position, same methodology. A two-person rotation meant sustained coverage, which meant formal authorization, which meant the hawkage. They haven't moved on me yet, he said. If they had the bunker's location, they'd have breached by now. They're watching, gathering, building a case. They know it's me, but they don't know where you are. How long, before they find the bunker? He closed his eyes, opened them. Hinata, the name landed with an impact Kurenai didn't expect. Hinata Hyuga, she can see through walls, through earth. Through anything that isn't specifically shielded against the Byakugan. He pressed his palms harder against the table. I built countermeasures into the containment arrays, specific interference patterns designed to scatter Byakugan penetration. But Hinata's range and precision are, she's better than most of her clan. If she's looking in the right direction, at the right depth, she might be able to detect the void, the shape of the shielded space, even if she can't see inside. Would she look? His jaw tightened. She watches me. She's been watching me for years. I know that. I've always known. The way he said it carried a weight that made Kurenai pause. Not annoyance, not discomfort. Something else, something that lived in the same complicated space as everything else about this boy. He'd known someone was watching him, and he'd never told her to stop, and he'd never used it, and he'd never acknowledged it, because even surveillance, even unwanted attention, was still someone seeing you. If Hinata is involved in the investigation, Kurenai said carefully, and she uses her Byakugan to scan underground, she'll find the shielded space. It'll look anomalous, a void at 40 meters that shouldn't be there. She won't be able to see inside, but she'll see the shape, and the investigation will have a location. Yes. How long until they breach? Naruto's breathing had slowed. The shaking had subsided to a faint tremor in his fingers, controlled but not gone. If they find the void tonight, they'll need to plan the approach. The access points are sealed, they can't just dig down. The containment arrays would resist conventional excavation. They'd need a seal specialist to disable the outer layers, which means bringing in someone from the SEAL division or Kakashi. That's hours of work minimum. If they move at dawn, then we have tonight. He looked at her. The raw thing was still there, still visible, but something else was emerging now, the operational mind, the planner, the part of him that had built all of this coming back online, reassembling itself around the crisis. She could see the calculation happening in real time, the branching decision trees, the contingency evaluation. I have exit protocols, he said. The tertiary access point, outside the village walls. I can move you to a secondary location, another sealed space farther out, harder to find. No. He stopped. No, Kurenai said again. You're not moving me, you're not running, that's not how this ends. If they breach the bunker, then they find me. Alive, unharmed, and they find you here not running. She leaned forward. Naruto, listen to me. What happens in the next 12 hours determines everything. Not just for you, for the question you asked me. Whether the village is worth protecting. Whether the system can be changed or only broken. If you run, that answer is no. If you run, you're confirming everything the protocols say about you, the weapon that went rogue, the containment failure, the kill on-site scenario. And if you stay, you're a person. A person who did something wrong and is standing in front of the consequences instead of hiding from them. And people, complicated, difficult, broken people, are something the village has to deal with differently than weapons. His hands were trembling again. She could see the war behind his eyes, the operational mind screaming run, survive, execute the contingency against something deeper, something that had started making sounds 5 days ago and wouldn't be silent. They'll kill me, he said. His voice was very quiet. The tertiary protocol. You told me. I told you the protocol exists. I didn't tell you it's inevitable. Kurenai held his gaze. I'm a Jonin of this village. My word carries weight. If I walk out of this bunker and tell them you cooperated, that you didn't harm me, that you chose to stay, that changes the calculus. It doesn't erase what you did, but it changes what happens next. Why would you do that? The question was so raw, so genuinely bewildered, that it hit her like a physical blow. He couldn't understand why she would help him. The concept was so foreign to his experience that he couldn't even frame it as a possibility. He had to ask, the way a child asks about something they've only read about in books. Kurenai reached across the table. Her bound hands couldn't reach his, but she put them in the space between them, the neutral zone, the middle ground, and left them there. Because I've spent 5 days in this room with you, and I know what you are. You're not a weapon. You're not a monster. You're a 16-year-old kid who was left alone in the dark until the dark started making sense. And now you've built something extraordinary and terrible out of that darkness, and you don't know what to do with it. She held steady. And because someone should have said this to you a long time ago, and nobody did, and that's not your fault. None of this is your fault. What you did, taking me, holding me here, that's your responsibility. But the thing that made you into someone who would do this, that's on us. That's on the village. And I'm not going to let the village pretend otherwise by letting you disappear. The trembling in his hands stopped. Not because the emotion passed, she could see it still raging behind his eyes, a storm contained in a space too small for it. But because something else had taken hold, something that looked from the outside like a decision. You want me to surrender, he said. I want you to choose. That's different. He was quiet for a long time. The ambient hum of the seals filled the silence, steady and indifferent, the mechanical heartbeat of the prison he'd built for her that had become. She realized now, with the clarity that only comes at the edge of endings, a prison for both of them. He'd locked her in and locked himself in with her, and the door he'd sealed so carefully against the outside world had sealed him away from everything he might have been. If I open the door, he said, if I let you walk out, they'll come in and they'll take me and I'll never. His voice cracked. The first time. The first real crack, not a managed fissure but a break, and what came through it was the voice of a boy, just a boy, small and frightened and alone. I've never had anyone listen to me before. Not like this. Not really, and if they take me, that's over. Everything goes back to silence. Kurenai felt something shatter inside her chest. Quietly, completely, the way glass shatters when you drop it on a soft surface, no dramatic crash, just the sound of something whole becoming something that could never be whole again. It won't, she said. I won't let it. You can't promise that. No, I can't. But I can promise to try, and I can promise to be there, and I can promise that after 5 days in this room, I am not going to forget you. Nobody is going to forget you, Naruto, not after this. The village is going to have to see you now, and they're going to have to deal with what they see. That's something. It's not enough, but it's something. He looked at her hands on the table. At the seal bindings around her wrists, the tags still warm against her skin, the work of his own design. He reached out, slowly, like someone reaching toward a flame, and touched the edge of the binding on her left wrist. I can remove these, he said. It takes about 30 seconds. Okay. His fingers worked the seal with a precision she could feel through the vibration of the tag, subtle adjustments. Chakra pulses directed at specific nodes in the array, the technical skill as fluent and natural as breathing. The tag pulsed, dimmed, and went cold. The binding loosened, and she pulled her left hand free, flexing the fingers, feeling the first tingle of chakra beginning to circulate normally through her tenketsu. He did the right wrist. Then the ankle suppression seal. Each one released with the same careful precision, and with each release, she felt herself coming back. Not all at once, not in a flood, but in layers, the way warmth returns to frozen hands. Chakra flowing, tenketsu opening, the familiar reservoir of energy that had been her companion since childhood filling back up from the depleted nothing she'd been living with for 5 days. When the last seal came off, Kurenai stood up and felt like herself for the first time in what might as well have been a lifetime. Naruto sat in the chair and looked up at her. No bindings, no suppression, a full-power Jonin standing over him in a sealed room with her chakra restored and every reason in the world to put him through the wall. He didn't move to defend himself, didn't stand, didn't reach for a weapon or activate a seal or do any of the things that a person who'd built the most sophisticated containment system in Konoha's history should do when they voluntarily disarmed it. He just sat there and waited for whatever she would do. Kurenai looked at him for a long moment. Then she sat back down. "Tell me about the plan," she said. "All of it. Everything you haven't told me. If I'm going to speak for you when they come through that door, I need to know what I'm speaking about." Something broke open in his face, not the wall, not the composure, something else. Something that had been locked shut for so long that the opening of it was almost painful to watch. The way a fist that's been clenched for years hurts when it finally uncurls. He talked. On the surface, the night was alive with movement. Ibiki Morino had converted the Intelligence Division briefing room into a command center in the 2 hours since Hinata's revelation. Maps covered the walls. The standard village layout, overlaid with depth surveys, geological cross-sections, utility tunnel schematics. Hinata's void was marked in red on the depth survey, a small rectangle 40 meters below the surface, positioned beneath the residential district east of the Hawkage Tower. The room held 7 people. Ibiki, Asuma, Kakashi. Hiruzen Sarutobi, who had arrived without the hat and without the pipe, and with a face that carried something Asuma had never seen on it before and didn't want to name. 2 Anbu operatives, specialists in underground operations. Their masks pushed up onto their foreheads because the formality of anonymity felt obscene in this room. And Hinata, who sat in a corner with her Byakugan deactivated and her hands folded, and her presence radiating a quiet, fierce determination that made her look 10 years older than she was. 3 access points, Ibiki said, pointing to the map. Hinata identified the sealed passages connecting to the void. The primary appears to originate from or near the target's apartment building. The secondary connects to the civilian water system maintenance tunnels. The tertiary exits beyond the village wall, approximately 200 meters past the southeast gate. "The southeast gate," Kakashi repeated. "That's the patrol route, Kurenai's route?" "Yes." It's likely the tertiary access was used during the abduction. It would have allowed him to move from the pit site to the bunker without crossing the surface. Asuma stared at the map. The red rectangle. 40 meters below the street where he walked every day, below the buildings where people slept and ate and lived their ordinary lives. She was there, right there, close enough that if he could reach through the earth, he could touch her. "What's the breach plan?" he asked. "We have 2 options. Fast or careful?" Ibiki crossed his arms. "Fast means we locate the primary access point, disable the seal array, and go in hard. Anbu entry team, full tactical, maximum force. We'd be inside in minutes. And the risk? The bunker is sealed with arrays we don't fully understand. If the entry team triggers a failsafe, a self-destruct, a collapse mechanism, anything, we could lose both the target and the hostage." The word hostage landed in the room like a stone in still water. Asuma's jaw tightened until the muscles ached. "Option 2, Ibiki continued. "We approach through the secondary access, the maintenance tunnel. It's the least defended approach, based on Hinata's structural analysis. We send a small team, 3 to 4 operatives, with a seal specialist to disable the containment arrays from the outside. Slower, quieter, less risk of triggering failsafes. How slow? I estimate 4 to 6 hours to work through the seal layers. We'd need to start before dawn to breach by morning. That's too slow." Asuma's voice was flat. "Every hour we wait is an hour where the situation can change. If he realizes we've found the void, he runs. He has an exit outside the walls. Which is why we seal the tertiary access first," Ibiki said. "Before we begin the primary breach, we post a team at the external exit point. If he tries to run, we catch him. And if he doesn't run, if he fights." The question came from Kakashi, and it carried a weight that stilled the room. Everyone turned to look at him. He was leaning against the wall near the door, his hands in his pockets, his visible eye fixed on the red rectangle on the map. "He's the Nine-Tails Jinchuriki," Kakashi said. "If he accesses the fox's chakra, even partially, the containment team will be outmatched. The bunker will amplify the destruction. We need to plan for the possibility that this ends in a fight we can't win in a confined space." Hiruzen spoke for the first time. "It won't come to that." Everyone looked at the Hokage. He stood at the edge of the room, near the window, his profile lit by the ambient light of the village that he'd spent his life serving. He looked old, not the performative old, not the strategic old. Just old in the way that meant tired and honest and out of strategies. "I will be part of the entry team," Hiruzen said. "Lord Hokage," Ibiki began, "this is not negotiable." Hiruzen's voice was quiet, but the authority in it was absolute. The kind of authority that didn't come from the hat or the office, but from the marrow, from the decades of being the person whose decisions shaped a village. "Naruto Uzumaki is my responsibility. His life, his choices, and the circumstances that led to those choices, I bear responsibility for all of it. I will not send soldiers to resolve a failure that is mine. With respect, sir, this is a tactical operation, not a..." I sealed his fate 16 years ago when I chose to let the village treat him as a pariah and convinced myself that benign neglect was the same as protection. Hiruzen turned from the window, and his eyes were clear and hard and carrying something that a Sumer recognized, with a shock, as grief. Not the fresh kind, the old kind, the kind that had been there for years, buried under duty and justification and the comfortable fiction that he's fine, he's coping, he's adjusting. "I will be there when the door opens," the Hokage said. "And he will see my face, and I will tell him the truth, and whatever happens after that is what I deserve." The room was silent. Ibiki looked at Asuma. Asuma looked at Kakashi. Kakashi looked at the map. "Dawn," Kakashi said. "We move at dawn. The secondary access, the maintenance tunnel approach." SEAL specialist, entry team of 4, Ibiki, Asuma, myself, and the Hokage. Anbu on the tertiary exit as containment. Hinata on overwatch, Byakugan active, feeding us real-time structural data as we move through the SEAL layers. "And if he fights?" Ibiki asked again. Kakashi's eye moved to the Hokage. The old man met his gaze. "Then I'll handle it," Hiruzen said, "the way I should have handled everything else." Below the village, in the amber light, Naruto was telling Kurenai the truth, not the curated truth. Not the strategic disclosure, the calculated vulnerability, the managed revelation he'd been offering in their conversations. The real truth, unfiltered, unstructured, coming out of him in a way that felt less like speaking and more like bleeding. He told her about the first 5 years. The orphanage, where the matrons didn't hit him but didn't hold him, didn't comfort him when he cried, didn't come when he called in the dark. Where the other children learned quickly that playing with him meant the adults would look at you with the same cold distance they looked at him. And so the other children stopped playing with him, and then stopped seeing him. And then he learned that invisible was a thing a person could be even when they were standing right in front of you. He told her about the apartment. 7 years old, alone, with a stipend that covered food and rent and nothing else. In a building where the other tenants left notes on his door telling him to keep quiet, to stop existing so loudly. He told her about learning to cook because the restaurants wouldn't serve him, about learning to sew because the shops charged him triple, about learning to fight because the older kids figured out early that he was a target nobody would defend. He told her about the academy, where Uruka was the single bright point in a landscape of indifference, and how that single bright point had become both his salvation and his most painful reference point. Proof that kindness was possible, which made its absence everywhere else impossible to ignore. He told her about the fox, about the moment he'd understood what it was and what it meant and why the village, his village, the place he was supposed to belong to, looked at him and saw something that should be dead. About the way that understanding had settled into his bones like a second skeleton, an internal architecture of rejection that supported everything else he was. And he told her about the day the mask was born. He was 9. He'd been sitting on the swing outside the academy, the one that everyone knew was his because nobody else would use it, watching the parents collect their children after class. Watching the hands on shoulders, the ruffled hair, the casual, unconscious intimacy of people who belonged to each other. He'd watched and watched and watched, and something inside him had gone very quiet. Not angry, not sad, just quiet, the way a machine goes quiet when you switch it off. And in that quiet, he'd made a decision. The real Naruto, the one who hurt, who wanted, who reached out and got nothing back, that Naruto was a liability. That Naruto could be used against him. That Naruto needed to go somewhere safe, somewhere deep, somewhere nobody could find him. So he'd built a box and put himself inside it and locked it shut and thrown away the key and put a grinning, shouting, orange-wearing scarecrow in his place. And the scarecrow had walked through the village for 7 years, and nobody had ever noticed the difference. Until you, he said. Kurenai didn't speak. She was sitting very still, her hands on the table, her restored chakra humming beneath her skin, and she was listening the way she'd been listening for 5 days. Actively, aggressively, with every tool she had, but the tools weren't working the way they were supposed to. The professional distance was gone. The analytical framework was gone. She was just listening, human to human, and what she heard was the sound of a childhood being described by someone who'd survived it the way you survive a natural disaster, by becoming something that could endure it. I need to show you something, she said. Naruto looked at her. The rawness was still there, the openness, the unclenched fist. My chakra's restored. My genjutsu is available. She held up her hands, free now, the seal tags lying discarded on the table. I want to show you something, and it requires physical contact. A genjutsu, not an attack, not a trap. A technique I use in therapy sessions with traumatized shinobi. It allows 2 people to share a perceptual space, a mindscape. His eyes narrowed. The operational mind stirring, assessing the threat. You'd be entering my mind, he said. We'd be entering a shared space. Both of us. You'd have as much control as I would, more actually, since it's your mind we'd be navigating. I can't force anything, can't extract anything, can't do anything you don't allow. If at any point you want to stop, you push me out and it's over. Why? Because you've been telling me about your life with words, and words are filters. They organize and structure and inevitably distort. I want to see what's underneath the words. Not because I doubt what you're telling me, I believe you, but because what I'm going to say to the people who come through that door tomorrow needs to be built on something deeper than belief. It needs to be built on understanding. He stared at her. She could see the calculation, the risk assessment, the part of him that had survived by never trusting anyone, warring with the part that had spent 5 days talking to a woman who listened. And if you see the fox, then I see the fox. It's not pleasant in there, the mindscape. I've been inside it, the seal space where the fox is kept. It's not, he stopped, started again. I don't want you to see it. Why? His mouth worked. Because it's ugly and you'll look at me differently. Naruto, I've spent 5 days in a box you put me in. I've eaten your food and read your books and listened to you explain why you kidnapped me. I've watched you shake with fear and make jokes about dinner and remove my bindings knowing I could kill you. She held his gaze. You can't show me anything that changes the picture I already have. But you might show me something that completes it. He was quiet for a long time. Then he reached across the table and placed his hand, palm up, on the surface between them. An offering. An act of trust so enormous, given everything he was, that Kurenai felt the weight of it like a physical thing pressing on her chest. She placed her hand on his. His palm was warm, roughened with calluses from years of work that nobody knew about. She felt his chakra, vast, layered, the human signature and the fox signature intertwined like 2 rivers sharing a channel. And for a moment, she just held the contact, letting both of them adjust. Then she formed the seal with her free hand and said, "Close your eyes." He closed his eyes. She closed hers. The mindscape opened around them like a door swinging wide onto a landscape that took Kurenai's breath away. She'd used this technique dozens of times with shinobi suffering from trauma, Anbu operatives, veterans, survivors of missions that had broken something inside them. Every mindscape was different, shaped by the individual's psychology, their experiences, their deepest sense of self. She'd seen dark forests and empty rooms and endless oceans and featureless plains. She thought she'd seen the full range of what a wounded mind could produce. She was wrong. Naruto's mindscape was a city. Not Konoha, something else, something that shared Konoha's bones but not its flesh. A city built of the same stone and wood and tile, the same rooftop lines and narrow streets, but twisted, distorted. The buildings leaned at angles that shouldn't have supported their own weight. The streets branched and doubled back on themselves, forming loops and dead ends and passages that led nowhere. The sky overhead was a uniform gray, not clouded, not dark, just gray, the color of absence, the color of a sky that had never learned what blue was, and it was empty. Every street, every building, every doorway and window and rooftop empty. Not destroyed, not ruined, just vacant. A city built for thousands, occupied by no one. Kurenai stood in the middle of a wide street and turned slowly, taking it in. The detail was extraordinary. She could see the grain in the wooden shutters, the cracks in the paving stones, the moss growing in the gutters. This wasn't an abstraction. This was a fully realized space, rendered with the obsessive precision of someone who had spent years building an interior world as complex and controlled as the bunker beneath the village. Naruto stood beside her. In the mindscape, he looked younger. The same features, the same blue eyes, but with the mask completely absent and the composure completely absent and nothing in their place but the undefended face of a boy who was showing someone his home and hoping they wouldn't flinch. "This is what's inside," he said. "The city. I've been building it since I was 9. Every time I needed somewhere to go, when the apartment was too quiet, when the village was too loud, when the mask got too heavy, I came here. Added a street, built a building, made it bigger." Kurenai looked at the empty buildings, the vacant windows. The streets designed for crowds that didn't exist. "You built a whole city," she said, "and there's nobody in it." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The city answered for him. The desperate, monumental loneliness of a child who had constructed an entire world inside himself because the world outside had no room for him. She walked. He walked beside her. The streets wound through districts she could identify, residential blocks with small apartments, a market area with empty stalls, a training ground with obstacle posts casting shadows on bare earth. All of it familiar. All of it Konoha, refracted through a lens of isolation. A version of the village built by someone who knew every inch of it and belonged to none of it. They turned a corner, and the city changed. The buildings ended. The street opened onto a vast space, a plaza, maybe, or a clearing, and at its center was something that made Kurenai stop walking. A cage. It was enormous. Iron bars as thick as tree trunks, stretching upward into the gray sky until they vanished, stretching left and right beyond the edges of vision. Behind the bars, darkness. Not the absence of light, a presence of dark, a substance, thick and heavy and pulsing with a chakra so massive it distorted the air around it like heat haze, and in the darkness, eyes. Red, slitted, vast. Looking out through the bars with an intelligence that was ancient and alien and absolutely, terrifyingly aware, the Ninetales. Kurenai had known, intellectually, what the fox was. Every shinobi in the village knew the stories, the statistics, the clinical descriptions in the classified files. 9 tails, each one capable of toppling mountains. Chakra reserves that dwarfed entire villages. A being of pure destructive energy, sealed by the 4th Hokage into the body of a newborn child on the night of Konoha's greatest catastrophe, the intellectual knowledge had not prepared her for this. The fox's chakra pressed against her perception like a wall of heat, like standing too close to a furnace, like the moment before a thunderclap when the air goes thick and the hair on your arms stands up and every animal instinct screams run. She didn't run. She stood beside Naruto in the shadow of the cage, and looked up at the eyes and the darkness and the iron bars that a child's mind had built to contain something that shouldn't have been containable. "This is where it lives," Naruto said. His voice was quiet, matter-of-fact, the voice of someone giving a tour of a place so familiar they'd forgotten it was extraordinary. "The seal creates this space, the cage, the bars, the containment structure. The fourth designed it, but the city around it, that's mine. I built the city around the cage because I didn't want it to just be a cage. I wanted there to be something else, something besides the fox and the bars and the dark." The eyes in the darkness shifted, moved, focused on Kurenai with a precision that made her skin crawl. "A visitor." The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, a vibration that she felt in her bones rather than heard with her ears. Deep, ancient, amused in a way that had nothing to do with humor. "The boy brings a guest to our little city. How novel." Naruto's jaw tightened. "Ignore it." "It talks when it wants to make an impression." She sees the cage. She sees the city. Does she see the boy? The eyes narrowed. Does she see what 16 years of your village's kindness has built? A child who talks to demons for company, who constructs imaginary cities because the real one won't have him, who kidnaps the first person to treat him like a human because he doesn't know how else to keep someone close. I said ignore it. Truth isn't comfortable, boy. It never was. Kurenai looked at the fox, looked at those vast, ancient red eyes, and felt the intelligence behind them, not evil, not exactly. Something older than evil and more complicated. A being that had existed for centuries, been worshipped, feared, hunted, and sealed, and had spent the last 16 years watching a child grow up alone in a city built for crowds that would never come. "You've been watching him," she said to the fox. "All this time. I live inside him. I see what he sees, feel what he feels when he allows himself to feel." The voice was quieter now, less theatrical. "I watched them ignore him. I watched them hate him. I watched a child beg for scraps of recognition from a village that used his body as a prison and his existence as a cautionary tale. And I watched him stop begging and start building and become something that none of them saw coming." The eyes shifted back to Naruto. "I told you years ago that they would never see you. I was wrong. This one sees you. The question is whether you can survive being seen." Naruto said nothing. But Kurenai felt his chakra shift beside her. A tremor in the vast layered energy, human and fox intertwined, and the tremor felt like a crack spreading, like ice breaking, like the moment before a dam gives way. She turned from the cage, took Naruto's hand in the mindscape. His hand was small, a child's hand, and that detail nearly broke her, and said, "Show me the rest." He showed her. They walked the city. Every street, every building, every empty room. He showed her the apartment he'd built in the mindscape, a replica of the real one, but different. Warmer. Furnished the way a child would furnish a home if they'd never lived in one. Too many blankets, too many lamps, books stacked in every corner. A home designed by someone who didn't know what a home looked like, but was trying their hardest to imagine it. He showed her the training ground where he'd practiced his seal work, the walls covered in arrays and calculations, and the obsessive, iterative refinements of someone teaching themselves through trial and error, and the sheer bloody-minded refusal to stop. He showed her the room where he kept the mask. A small room, barely more than a closet, with a single shelf, and on that shelf a face. The grinning, bright, orange face of the boy the village knew, rendered in the mindscape with photographic detail. Every line of the smile, every crinkle around the eyes, every detail of the performance that had protected him and imprisoned him in equal measure. Kurenai looked at the mask on the shelf and at the boy standing beside her, and the distance between them, between the thing he showed the world and the thing he actually was a chasm so wide it made her dizzy. "I need you to know something," she said. They were standing in the mask room, and the ambient light of the mindscape was the same uniform gray, and the city was the same monumental emptiness, and everything was exactly as broken as it had always been. "What you showed me tonight, the city, the fox, the mask, all of it, it doesn't change what you did to me. It doesn't make it okay. Taking someone's freedom is wrong, and you knew it was wrong when you did it, and understanding why you did it doesn't undo the harm. He nodded, the undefended face. The boy's face. But it does change what I understand about why, and understanding changes what's possible. She squeezed his hand, the child's hand, in this place where he was closest to what he really was. When they come through the door tomorrow, I'm going to stand between you and whatever they want to do. Not because you deserve protection, you're going to face consequences for this, and you should. But because what you deserved your whole life was someone who would stand up for you, and nobody did, and I'm not going to let that be the end of the story. Naruto looked at her. In the mindscape, his eyes were brighter than in the real world, bluer, clearer, the color they might have been if the things behind them hadn't spent 16 years being compressed into something hard and flat and survivable. I don't know how to do this, he said. The not running. The standing still. I've never, he stopped, breathed. I've been invisible my whole life. If they see me, the real me, not the mask, I don't know what happens. I don't know who I am without the architecture. Then we find out together. The mindscape trembled. Not a collapse, a shift, like the city itself was adjusting, accommodating a new presence, a new possibility. The gray sky flickered, and for just a moment, so brief she might have imagined it, Kurenai saw a thread of blue at the edges, a crack of color in the gray. A sky beginning, just barely, to learn what blue was. She released the technique. The mindscape dissolved, the city and the cage and the mask room folding back into the space behind Naruto's eyes, and they were in the bunker again, sitting at the table, her hand on his, the amber light steady and warm. Naruto opened his eyes. She opened hers. They looked at each other across the small table. And the distance between captor and prisoner, between Jonin and Genin, between the village's weapon and the village's victim, was exactly what it had always been, and nothing like what it had been. Because something had shifted in the space that words couldn't reach, the space where one person's truth met another person's witness. Okay, Naruto said. His voice was rough, scraped. Okay, I'll stay. Kurenai nodded. She released his hand gently and sat back. Then we should probably get some sleep. If I know Ibiki, and I do, they'll be here at dawn. She stood, crossed to the cot, and lay down with her back to the wall and her face to the door, the way she'd slept every night in this room. Naruto remained at the table for a long time, sitting in the chair where she'd spent 5 days watching him, and then he moved to the corner of the room, sat on the floor with his back against the wall, and closed his eyes. Neither of them slept. But they rested, in the shared silence of two people waiting for morning, and the silence was different from every other silence in Kurenai's life. It wasn't empty. It was full of everything they'd said, and everything they hadn't, and the vast, complicated, irreducible reality of what they'd become to each other, which was not friends, not allies, not captor and captive, but something without a name. Something that existed only in the space between a boy who'd been invisible and a woman who'd been made to see. Above them, the village turned in its sleep, and the Anbu watched the dark apartment, and the Hokage sat awake in his office preparing for the morning, and Asuma lay in the dark with his trench knives and his fear, and Shikamaru stared at the ceiling of his bedroom running contingencies. And Hinata sat at her desk with her hands folded and her eyes open, waiting. The night deepened. The dawn approached, and in the bunker, in the amber light, the boy and the woman waited together, and neither of them was alone. Chapter 5. No clean hands. The maintenance tunnel smelled like wet stone and rust. Asuma moved through it at a crouch, the low ceiling forcing his shoulders into a hunch that made his back ache within the first 30 meters. Behind him, single file in the narrow space, came Kakashi, then Hiruzen, then Ibiki. The tunnel was barely wide enough for one person, and dark enough that even shinobi eyes needed a moment to adjust, the only light coming from the small seal-powered lamp Kakashi held in his left hand, its amber glow throwing their shadows into grotesque shapes on the dripping walls. The civilian water system maintenance tunnels ran beneath the eastern residential district, like veins beneath skin. a network of access corridors built 50 years ago for engineers to service the underground pipes and pumping stations that kept the village's water flowing. Most of them were unused now, replaced by newer systems, their entrances bolted shut behind rusted grates and forgotten by everyone except the Public Works Department, which kept a map that Ibiki had requisitioned at 0300 without explaining why. Hinata's voice came through the small communication seal affixed to Asuma's collar, barely more than a whisper, transmitted through chakra rather than sound. 30 meters ahead. The secondary access junction is on your left. You'll see a sealed panel in the tunnel wall, roughly 1 meter square. The seal arrays begin at the panel and extend approximately 15 meters in all directions. Asuma keyed his acknowledgement, kept moving. His trench knives were in his hands, not because he expected to use them in the next 30 meters, but because his hands needed something to hold that wasn't the empty space where Kurenai's hand should have been. They'd been moving for an hour. The initial approach through the maintenance tunnel had been straightforward. Hinata's Byakugan provided a real-time map of the infrastructure ahead, including the structural modifications that marked where Naruto's construction interfaced with the existing tunnel system. The boy had tapped into the maintenance network at a junction point that the Public Works maps listed as a dead end, sealed behind what appeared from the tunnel's side to be unremarkable stone wall, but which Hinata's eyes revealed as a layered seal array of considerable sophistication. They'd reached the 15-meter perimeter of the seal arrays 20 minutes ago. Since then, Kakashi had been working, crouched against the tunnel wall with his headband pushed up, and both eyes active. One hand pressed flat against the stone while the other traced calculations in a small notebook. His Sharingan reading the seal architecture with the obsessive precision of a man trying to defuse a bomb he didn't fully understand. Asuma watched him work and tried not to think about time. Dawn was 40 minutes away. The Anbu containment team was in position at the tertiary exit beyond the village wall. Hinata was on a rooftop 3 blocks north, her Byakugan at maximum range, feeding them structural data through the communication seal. Everything was in position. Everything was ready. Except for the part where they had to actually get through the door. Kakashi lowered his hand from the wall and turned to face the team, his Sharingan eye spinning lazily, cataloging and processing. The outer seal layer is a detection grid. Anything that passes through it without the correct chakra signature triggers an alert, not an alarm, something more subtle. A modification in the ambient seal frequency that would tell the operator someone was approaching. "Can you disable it?" Ibiki asked. "Already have." The detection grid is keyed to register foreign chakra, but it has a blind spot. It's calibrated for shinobi-level signatures. The civilian maintenance workers who occasionally pass through this tunnel register as background noise. I've suppressed our signatures to match that baseline. Ibiki's scarred face was unreadable in the amber lamplight. And the inner layers? 3 more. A structural reinforcement array that hardens the stone against physical breach, a chakra absorption layer that would drain any jutsu used against the wall. And behind those, the actual access mechanism, a signature-keyed seal that responds only to a specific, periodically changing chakra pattern. Kakashi paused. The access mechanism is the problem. It's a rotating encryption, changed every 72 hours. Without the current key, we can't open it, and brute forcing it would trigger the absorption layer, which would eat whatever we throw at it. "So we go around," Asuma said. "We go through, but not through the seal, through the stone beside it." Kakashi pointed at the wall, at a spot roughly 2 meters to the right of where the sealed panel was hidden. The reinforcement array covers the panel and the immediate surrounding area, but it's finite. It has edges, and at those edges, the stone is just stone. You want to tunnel around the sealed section. I want to make a hole in the wall that the seals aren't protecting. It'll put us into the passage behind the panel rather than through it. The passage itself has its own seal layers, but they're secondary, designed to monitor movement rather than prevent entry. I can suppress those as we move through. Asuma looked at the wall, looked at Kakashi, looked at his father, who had been silent since they entered the tunnel, moving with the deliberate economy of a man conserving every resource for the moment that mattered. "Do it," Hiruzen said. Kakashi placed both hands on the stone. His chakra flowed into it. Carefully, minimally, a precise application of earth-style manipulation that began dissolving the rock at a molecular level, turning solid stone to powder that drifted to the tunnel floor in a fine gray stream. He worked slowly, because speed would spike his chakra output and risk alerting the detection grid he'd already circumvented. The hole opened. A circle, roughly 70 centimeters in diameter, punched through 40 centimeters of stone into a space beyond. Cool air flowed through it, different from the tunnel air, drier, cleaner, carrying the faint ozone smell of active seal work. Kakashi peered through. Passage. Narrow, reinforced, sloping downward. I can see seal arrays on the walls, monitoring type, low power. Designed to track movement, not prevent it. "Hinata," Ibiki said into his communication seal. "What do you see through the breach?" A pause, then Hinata's voice, steady despite what Asuma could hear underneath it. "The passage runs approximately 40 meters at a 15-degree decline. It terminates at the sealed space I identified earlier. I can see the containment shell more clearly from this angle. The arrays are dense, multi-layered. And I can see..." Another pause. "I can see 2 chakra signatures inside, both present, both stationary, both present, both alive." Asuma's grip on his trench knives tightened until the metal bit into his palms. "Positions?" Ibiki asked. "One signature is on the far side of the space, near the west wall, lying down. The other is in the southeast corner on the floor. Both appear to be at rest. Resting." Asuma felt something surge in his chest that was equal parts relief and fury relief, because she was alive. Alive and in one place, and they were 40 meters from reaching her. And fury because she'd been in a hole in the ground for 5 days, while the village that was supposed to protect her stumbled around in the dark. "Let's go," he said. Kakashi went first. He slipped through the hole with the fluid ease of someone who had spent years entering spaces he wasn't supposed to be in, landing in the passage beyond on silent feet. Asuma followed, squeezing his broader frame through the gap, feeling the edges of raw stone scrape his shoulders. Then Ibiki. Then Hiruzen, who moved through the hole with a dignity that should have been impossible for a man his age in a space that small. But the third Hokage had never let physical reality tell him what he could and couldn't do. The passage was exactly as Kakashi had described, narrow, sloping, reinforced with the same smooth earth-style work that the forensic team had found in the pit. The seal arrays on the walls glowed faintly as they passed, registering their presence, but Kakashi's suppression held, and no alarms triggered, no traps activated, no fail-safes engaged. They moved in silence. 4 shinobi descending into the earth, toward a door they couldn't see yet, and a confrontation none of them were ready for. Asuma's heart was beating so hard he could feel it in his temples, in his fingertips, in the trench knives that were extensions of his hands. Every step brought him closer. Every meter of packed earth that passed beneath his feet was 1 less meter between him and the woman he should have been here for 5 days ago. The passage leveled out. Ahead, in the dim glow of the monitoring seals, a wall. Smooth, featureless, distinguished from the surrounding stone only by the faint shimmer of active seal work across its surface. The entrance to the bunker, the final barrier, the last door between the village and its sins. Kakashi stopped, studied the wall. His Sharingan spun, reading the architecture, decoding the arrays, mapping the structure of the final seal layer. "This is the primary containment barrier," he said, his voice barely above a breath. "Signature-keyed, rotating encryption. I can't open it, but..." He placed his hand on the surface and his Sharingan eye narrowed. "The encryption was changed recently, within the last 12 hours, and the new key is..." He stopped, blinked, looked again. "What?" Asuma demanded. "The key is null. The encryption is set to null. The door is..." Kakashi pressed his palm flat against the seal. The arrays dimmed. The wall shimmered. The door is unlocked. Silence. 4 shinobi stood in a narrow passage 40 meters below the streets of their village and stared at an unlocked door and understood, each in their own way, what it meant. He'd left it open. He knew they were coming, and he'd left the door open. Formation, Ibiki said, his voice clicking into the clipped efficiency of operational command. Asuma on point. Kakashi left flank, I'll take right. Lord Hawkage. Behind them, Hiruzen said. I go in last. Ibiki looked like he wanted to argue. Didn't. There was something in the Hawkage's voice that precluded argument, not authority, not command, but a quieter thing. A request. Let me do this in the right order. Let the boy see the people he's wronged before he sees the person who wronged him. Asuma stepped to the wall. Placed his hand on the surface the way Kakashi had, feeling the seal array respond, a faint pulse of recognition, and then the wall simply wasn't there. It dissolved like mist, like a genjutsu dispelling, and the space beyond opened up in front of him, and the amber light spilled out like something warm and living, and Asuma saw her. She was sitting on the cot, against the far wall, legs crossed, hands on her knees. Alert, composed, watching the door with the steady gaze of someone who'd been expecting this and had prepared herself for it. She was in her patrol clothes, rumpled, slept in, 5 days worn. Her hair was loose, which he'd never seen in public, and there was something about that detail, the private, vulnerable, domestic wrongness of it, that hit him harder than anything else. He took 1 step into the room and stopped, because his body couldn't decide between running to her and collapsing. Kurenai, her name in his mouth, the realest thing he'd ever said. She looked at him, and her face did something that made his heart stutter, a series of micro-expressions, too fast for anyone else to track, that he read the way he read weather. Relief, love, pain. And then something harder, something deliberate, a composure that settled over her features like armor being put on in real time. Asuma. Her voice was steady. Of course it was. Before you do anything, I need you to listen to me. He was already scanning the room, the cot, the table, the bookshelves, the bathroom alcove, the amber seal lights, the careful, meticulous construction of a space designed to hold a person. And in the far corner, sitting on the floor with his back against the wall, and his knees drawn up and his hands visible and empty, a blond boy in dark clothing who looked up at Asuma Sarutobi with blue eyes that held no mask, no defense, no performance, just a kid, sitting on the floor. Waiting for whatever came next, Asuma's vision went red. Not metaphorically, the rage hit him like a physical blow. A wave of heat and pressure that started in his chest and flooded outward until his hands were shaking, and his trench knives were coming up, and every combat instinct he'd ever developed was screaming threat, target, eliminate. Asuma. Kurenai's voice, sharp now, the command tone, the Jonin steel. Listen to me, he heard her. The words passed through the red haze and reached the part of him that was still thinking, still rational, still the man she loved instead of the weapon he'd been trained to be. He stopped. Didn't lower the knives, but stopped. Kakashi came through the door behind him, took in the room in a single Sharingan-assisted sweep, and positioned himself to Asuma's left. Ibiki entered right, his hand on the tanto at his hip but not drawing. They flanked the doorway, covering the angles, doing what training demanded even though the scene in front of them was nothing that training had prepared them for. Naruto hadn't moved. He sat in his corner and looked at the 3 armed shinobi who had entered his bunker, and his face was blank. Not the practiced blankness of the mask, but the empty, exhausted blankness of someone who'd spent the night disassembling every defense they had and hadn't had time to build new ones. His eyes moved past,